The banker's fist hit the desk like a gunshot. 3 weeks, Kemp, then I take everything. Matthew stood frozen, watching his life crumble until she stepped forward. The woman who'd arrived yesterday, the mail-order bride he'd barely spoken to, moved between him and ruin in an emerald dress. "You'll get your money," Evelyn said, her voice silk over steel. "But first let's discuss your mathematics." The room went silent. This moment would save them both or destroy everything. Stay with us until the end and comment what city you're watching from so we can see how far this story travels. The dust hadn't settled from the stagecoach wheels before Matthew Kemp realized he'd made a terrible mistake. She stood there in the brutal afternoon sun of Pinecrest, Nebraska territory, looking like she'd stepped out of a Boston drawing room and landed in hell by accident. Her dress was the color of a summer sky, impractical, expensive, utterly wrong for this place. The fabric probably cost more than he'd made all year. Her dark hair was pinned up in some complicated style that would last maybe an hour in the prairie wind, and her hands, delicate and pale, had never seen a day's hard work. This was his bride. This was the woman who was supposed to help him save the Rocking K Ranch. God help them both. Matthew removed his hat, suddenly conscious of the dust caked on his shirt, the 3-day stubble on his jaw, the way he probably smelled of cattle and desperation. He was 32 years old and felt 60. The land had aged him, carved lines into his face that hadn't been there 5 years ago, when his father was still alive, and the ranch still had hope. "Mr. Kemp." Her voice was refined, educated, with an accent that spoke of city streets and gas lamps, not prairie fires and drought. She descended from the coach with careful precision, one gloved hand accepting the driver's assistance. "Matthew Kemp." "Yes, ma'am." His own voice came out rougher than intended. "Miss Hart, I presume." "Evelyn." She smiled, and for a moment something shifted in her dark eyes, something that looked almost like relief. "Thank you for coming to meet me." As if he'd had a choice, as if there were anywhere else in the world he needed to be more than here, collecting the mail-order bride who represented his last desperate gamble to save everything his family had built. The driver hauled down 2 trunks too when Matthew had told her in his letters that space was limited, and dumped them in the dirt. Evelyn didn't flinch at the treatment of her belongings. Instead, she turned slowly, taking in Pinecrest with those steady, assessing eyes. The town wasn't much. 1 main street, maybe 20 buildings if you counted generously, the general store, the saloon, the bank that held the mortgage. On his soul, the church where they'd be married tomorrow if she didn't run screaming back to Boston tonight. Everything was the same sun-bleached gray weathered by wind and time and the casual cruelty of frontier life. "It's beautiful," she said. Matthew actually laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think beautiful means, but no, truly." She gestured toward the horizon where the prairie rolled out endlessly under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "Look at all that space, all that possibility." She turned back to him, and that smile was still there, warmer now. "In Boston, everything is already decided, already built, already finished. But here," she breathed deeply as if tasting the air, "here anything could happen." Something twisted in Matthew's chest, something he'd thought died with his father, with his dreams, with every dried-up crop and dead calf and letter from the bank. It felt dangerously close to hope. "We should get going," he said roughly, bending to grab one of her trunks. "Jesus, what did she have in here, bricks?" "It's an hour to the ranch, and we want to make it before dark." "Of course." She moved to take the other trunk. "I've got it," Matthew said quickly. "I'm perfectly capable." "Miss Hart." He fixed her with a look. "I may be broke, and I may be desperate enough to send for a wife through the mail, but I'm not so far gone that I let a woman carry her own luggage. Now get in the wagon." For a moment, something flashed in her eyes, something sharp and bright that made him think of lightning before a storm. Then she nodded, gathered her skirts, and climbed onto the wagon seat with more grace than it deserved. The ride started in silence. Matthew focused on the horses on the familiar rutted road that led home. He'd traveled this path 1,000 times into town for supplies for church, for those increasingly desperate meetings with Ernest Thornton at the bank. The land stretched out on both sides, brown and stubborn. It hadn't rained properly in months. The prairie grass crunched under the wagon wheels like old bones. "Tell me about the ranch," Eveline said finally. Matthew kept his eyes on the road. "Not much to tell. 160 acres, give or take. We run cattle mostly, though not as many as we used to. Had some wheat planted, but the drought." He shrugged. "My father built the place 20 years ago. Thought he was building something that would last generations. But life had other ideas." The bitterness leaked through despite his best efforts. "He died 3 years back. Heart gave out during a hard winter. Been just me since then, and I've been struggling." That was putting it mildly. The truth was darker, uglier. The truth was that he was 3 months behind on the mortgage, that he'd sold off half the herd just to make last year's payment, that Thornton had made it crystal clear the bank's patience was exhausted. "The letter you sent," Eveline said carefully, "you mentioned you needed help, a partner." "That's right." Matthew risked a glance at her. She sat straight-backed on the hard wagon seat, hands folded in her lap, watching the horizon like she could read secrets there. "I've been trying to work the place alone, but it's too much. The house is falling apart, the books are a mess, and I can barely keep up with the daily work, much less plan for the future." "So you sent for a wife?" "So I sent for a wife," he agreed. "Figured I'd be honest about it. I need help more than I need romance. Thought that would be fairer than pretending otherwise." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "And what did you expect when you imagined the woman who would answer your advertisement?" Matthew considered lying, then decided against it. They were past the point of pretty deceptions. "Someone sturdy," he admitted. "Someone used to hard work. A farmer's daughter, maybe, or a widow who knew what frontier life meant. Someone who could churn butter and mend fences and not mind that the house only has 2 rooms and the nearest neighbor is 5 miles away." "Someone," Eveline said softly, "who was nothing like me." "Ma'am." "It's all right, Mr. Kemp. I'm aware I don't look like a pioneer woman." There was something in her voice, not hurt exactly, but a kind of weary acknowledgement. "I'm aware that I'm probably the last person you wanted to see step off that coach." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." She turned to look at him fully now, and those dark eyes pinned him in place. "Let me be equally honest, then. I didn't come here because I dreamed of prairie adventures. I came because I had nowhere else to go." The admission hung between them stark and raw. "What happened?" Matthew asked. "My father was a businessman in Boston, successful, respected, wealthy enough that I never wanted for anything." Her voice went flat, mechanical, as if she was reciting facts that had happened to someone else. 2 years ago, he was accused of embezzling from his partners. The scandal was spectacular. Headlines in every paper. A trial that lasted 6 months. In the end, he was acquitted technically, but the damage was done. His business collapsed. His reputation was destroyed. He died last winter, and She took a shaky breath. "I found myself alone, unmarriageable, with whispers following me everywhere I went. Your advertisement seemed like Providence. A new start where no one knew my name or my history." Matthew felt something shift in his understanding of the woman beside him. She wasn't some pampered city girl looking for adventure. She was a refugee fleeing toward survival just like he was. "Did he do it?" The question came out before he could stop it. "Your father, did he steal that money?" "No." The answer was immediate, fierce, absolute. "He was many things proud, sometimes foolish, but he was not a thief. He was set up by a junior partner who needed a scapegoat for his own crimes. But proof is a luxury we couldn't afford, and reputation is everything in Boston society. Once it's lost," she trailed off. "Out here," Matthew said slowly, "nobody cares who your father was or what he did or didn't do. Hell, half the people in Nebraska are running from something. Fresh start is what the frontier's for." She smiled at him, then really smiled with warmth and gratitude that made her whole face transform. "That's what I'm hoping for, Mr. Kemp." "Matthew," he said, "if we're getting married tomorrow, you should probably call me Matthew." "Matthew," she repeated, testing the name. "And you must call me Eveline." The ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent, a collection of weathered buildings that looked even more pathetic than Matthew remembered. The main house was a two-room cabin his father had built with his own hands, solid but plain. The barn listed slightly to the left, needing repairs he couldn't afford. The chicken coop was held together with hope and baling wire. The whole place looked tired, defeated, hanging on through sheer stubbornness. He felt Evelyn go still beside him. "I know it's not much," Matthew started. "It's yours," she said simply. "That makes it everything." Something in his chest cracked open, some defensive wall he'd built up over years of loss and failure. This woman, this refined Boston lady, who should have taken one look at his failing ranch and demanded the next coach back east, was looking at his broken-down homestead like it mattered, like it was worth saving. Maybe he thought he'd been wrong about what he needed in a wife. They pulled up to the house as the first stars began appearing. Matthew climbed down, then offered his hand to help Evelyn descend. She took it without hesitation, her gloved fingers surprisingly strong in his. "I should warn you," he said as he grabbed her trunks. "The house is basic. There's a main room with the kitchen and a wood stove and a bedroom in the back. I've been sleeping out in the barn to give you privacy until we're properly married." "That's not necessary." "It is to me." He pushed open the door, revealing the interior. He tried to clean up this morning, swept the floor, put fresh flowers in a jar on the table, made sure the stove was working. But there was no hiding the poverty of the place. The furniture was rough and handmade. The walls were bare logs. The whole house could probably fit inside the parlor of whatever mansion she'd grown up in. Evelyn stepped inside, set down her bag, and turned in a slow circle. Matthew braced himself for disappointment, for tears, for the inevitable moment when the reality of what she'd agreed to would hit her. Instead, she walked to the table and touched the wildflowers gently. "You picked these for me." Yeah. Thought it might make the place seem less, they're perfect." She looked around again, and he could see her taking inventory: the cast iron stove, the rough table and chairs, the shelves on the wall, the door to the small bedroom. "It's clean. It's solid. It's a home, Matthew. Maybe not a grand one, but a real one. That's more than many people have." "There's a well out back," he heard himself saying. "Water's good. And the stove works fine once you get the hang of it. I've got supplies in the cupboard: flour, beans, some salt pork. Not fancy, but—" "Matthew." She turned to face him, cutting off his nervous babbling. "Stop apologizing for your life. You built something here. You've kept it going despite everything working against you. That takes strength." "It takes stupidity," he said harshly. "A smart man would have sold out 2 years ago, taken what he could get, and started over somewhere easier." "But you didn't." "No." He met her eyes. "I didn't. Because it matters to you. Because it was your father's legacy. Because walking away would have meant admitting defeat." She nodded slowly. "I understand that more than you know." The moment stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Then Evelyn cleared her throat and turned away, breaking the spell. "I should unpack," she said briskly. "And you should show me where things are. If I'm going to be useful, and I intend to be, I need to understand how the household works." "But Evelyn, you just got here. You must be exhausted from the journey." "I'm tired of being useless," she said, and there was steel underneath the refined accent. "In Boston, I spent 2 years being decorative and pitied and watching my life shrink to nothing. I came here to be more than that. So please let me start now." Matthew studied her for a long moment, seeing past the fine dress and the city manners to the determination beneath. She meant it. This wasn't polite protest or performative helpfulness. She genuinely wanted to work. "All right, Ma," he said. "Let me show you the ranch." They spent the next hour walking the property as twilight deepened into true night. Matthew pointed out the barn where he kept the remaining cattle, the empty fields where wheat should have been growing, the broken fence post that needed replacing, the dried-up creek bed that should have been running with water. With every revelation of failure, he expected her to wilt to realize she'd made a terrible mistake. But Evelyn just listened, asked questions, and took it all in with that same steady assessment. "You mentioned books," she said as they walked back toward the house, the prairie wind picking up around them. "Account books." "Such as they are." Matthew felt heat creep up his neck. "I'm not much for paperwork. Numbers were never my strong suit. I know roughly what I owe, what I've got, but the actual record keeping—" He trailed off. May I see them? Now. Is there a reason to wait? There wasn't really, except that Matthew was ashamed of those books of the crossed-out entries and the stained pages and the increasingly desperate calculations scratched in the margins. But if they were going to be married, if she was really going to be his partner in this disaster, she needed to know the truth. Inside, he lit the oil lamp and pulled out the ledger from under the bed, where he'd been keeping it. The cover was water-stained and bent. He set it on the table like a man presenting evidence at his own trial. "It's bad," he warned. "Real bad." Evelyn sat down, pulled the lamp closer, and opened to the first page. Matthew watched her face as she began reading, tracing her finger down the columns of numbers. Her expression didn't change, no shock, no dismay, just intense concentration. Minutes passed. She turned pages, made small sounds of understanding, occasionally paused to study an entry more carefully. Matthew found himself holding his breath, waiting for her verdict. Finally, she looked up. "You're 3 months behind on the mortgage. 3.5 now, probably. The bank is Ernest Thornton at Pinecrest Savings." "Yeah." "He's charging you 8% interest." "That's what we agreed to when my father took out the loan. It's also significantly higher than the standard rate for agricultural mortgages." She tapped the page. "And these penalty fees for late payments, they're excessive, almost predatory." Matthew blinked. "How do you know that?" "My father was a businessman. Remember, I grew up around contracts and interest rates and negotiations." She turned another page, frowning. "You had a good year 2 years ago. What happened?" "Drought hit. Lost most of the wheat crop. Cattle prices dropped because everyone was desperate to sell. Then I had to put down 6 head because of disease and—" He shrugged helplessly. "Everything went wrong at once. And you've been trying to catch up ever since, but the hole just keeps getting deeper." It wasn't a question. She'd seen it all there in the numbers, the slow hemorrhage of money, the desperate attempts to stay afloat, the inevitable decline toward total loss. "I've got maybe 3 weeks before Thornton forecloses," Matthew said flatly. "I've been trying to think of something, anything, but I can't sell the cattle because I need them for breeding stock. Can't sell the land piecemeal because nobody's buying in a drought. Can't borrow more because nobody's lending to a man who's already drowning." He laughed without humor. "That's why I sent for you, if I'm being completely honest. Thought maybe a wife could help me work harder, make the place more efficient, stretch what we've got. But looking at these numbers now with fresh eyes, I don't think hard work is going to save us." He expected her to close the book, to make some polite excuse, to perhaps suggest that the wedding tomorrow should be postponed while she reconsidered her options. Instead, Evelyn pulled the ledger closer and began flipping back through the pages, her brow furrowed in thought. "What about diversification?" she asked. "What? You're treating this as a cattle ranch, but you have land that could be used for other purposes. What about that orchard your father planted, the one you pointed out earlier?" "The apple trees." Matthew shook his head. "They're half wild, haven't been properly maintained in years. We get some fruit, but not enough to matter." "How much fruit?" "I don't know. A few bushels maybe. I mostly let them fall and rot because I don't have time to deal with them." Evelyn's eyes lit up with something that looked dangerously like excitement. "Matthew, there's a market for dried fruit. A significant market. If we could harvest those apples, dry them properly, package them, they'd be worth more than fresh fruit, and they'd keep indefinitely. We could sell them to merchants heading west on the wagon trains, to mining camps, to military posts. Dried apples are a luxury item in places where fresh fruit is scarce. I don't know anything about drying fruit. But I do." She sat back, and there was color in her cheeks now, animation in her voice. "My mother, before she died, she used to preserve everything. I helped her. I know the process, the timing, the methods, and the mathematics." She tapped the ledger again. "If we could produce even 50 pounds of dried apples at current market rates, that would generate enough income to make a mortgage payment, maybe 2. Hope was a dangerous thing. Matthew had learned that the hard way over the past 3 years. But sitting across from this woman who'd arrived just hours ago, who was looking at his failing ranch and seeing possibilities instead of ruin, he felt it stirring again despite his best efforts to kill it. "That would require an investment," he said slowly. "Drying rack storage containers, maybe hiring help for the harvest? How much do you have available?" "In cash." "Maybe $30. Then we'll make do with $30. She pulled a clean page toward her and began sketching a quick diagram. Drying racks can be built from scrap wood. Storage can be repurposed crates from the general store. The harvest can be just the two of us. It's labor-intensive but not complicated. She was writing now, calculating her handwriting neat and precise. The apples should be ripe in 6 weeks. That gives us time to prepare to build what we need to maybe make arrangements with merchants in advance. Evelyn. Matthew reached across the table, stilling her hand. Even if this works, and I'm not saying it will, one good season won't save the ranch. Not with the debt we're carrying. No, she agreed. But it's a start. One solution won't save us, but multiple small solutions might. Dried apples in the fall. What else do you have here that we haven't leveraged? What other resources are we overlooking? I don't think, Matthew. You know this land. What grows here, what's abundant. He forced himself to consider it seriously. Prairie grass, wildflowers. There's a good stand of cottonwood trees near the creek bed. Cottonwood is useful lumber. Could you harvest some, sell it? Maybe. In town, probably not much market, but what? There's a new railroad spur going in 30 miles south. They might need lumber for ties for building materials. He felt something shift in his mind, ideas connecting in ways he hadn't considered before. And the prairie grass people don't realize how much feed value it has even when it looks dead. I could bale some, sell it to the cavalry post for their horses. Yes. Evelyn's smile was brilliant. You see multiple income streams. We diversify, we adapt, we find ways to generate revenue that don't depend on cattle prices or rainfall. That's how we stabilize the foundation. And the mortgage? Her smile faded. That's the immediate crisis. For that, we need to negotiate with Thornton, buy time, restructure the terms if possible. He won't let me talk to him. Her voice was quiet but absolutely certain. After the wedding tomorrow, let me negotiate. Matthew stared at her. Evelyn Thornton is a hard man. He didn't get where he is by being generous or flexible. And with all due respect, you're a woman who just arrived from Boston. He's not going to... Matthew. She met his eyes squarely. Trust me. My father's business may have failed, but not because he didn't teach me how commerce works. I understand men like Thornton. I understand their mathematics and their motivations. I can speak his language in ways you can't. There was steel in her voice, confidence that bordered on arrogance. Part of Matthew wanted to protect her from the humiliation he was certain would come. But another part, the part that was drowning and desperate and running out of options, wanted to believe her. If he laughs you out of his office, then we'll be no worse off than we are now, Evelyn said practically. But I don't think he will. I think he'll listen, because I'm going to make him an offer that serves his interests as well as ours. What kind of offer? She smiled a different smile now, sharp and knowing. One that acknowledges he's a businessman, not a villain. He doesn't want your ranch, Matthew. Foreclosures are messy and time-consuming, and he'd have to find a buyer in a terrible market. What he wants is his money reliably with minimal risk. If I can show him a path to that, a restructured loan with realistic payments based on diversified income, he'll take it. Not because he's kind, but because it's smarter than the alternative. You sound very confident. I am confident, in this at least. Her expression softened. I may not know how to mend a fence or churn butter yet, Matthew, but I know numbers, I know business. Let me use what I'm good at to help us. The lamp flickered, throwing shadows across her determined face. Outside, the prairie wind howled softly against the cabin walls. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out lonely and fierce. Matthew took a deep breath and made his decision. All right, he said. After we're married tomorrow, we'll go talk to Thornton together. You can make your case. Not together, Evelyn corrected gently. I need to talk to him alone. Or rather, I need him to think I'm the one in control of the conversation. If you're there, he'll direct everything toward you as the man is the property owner. But if I go alone... She paused. Let me handle this my way, please. It went against everything he'd been raised to believe, that a man protected his wife, that a man handled his own business, that asking a woman to negotiate with someone like Thornton was wrong. But Matthew was desperate enough to set pride aside. Okay, he said, your way. Relief washed over her face. Thank you. They sat there in the lamplight, the silence settling comfortable between them now. The ledger lay open on the table, its grim story laid bare. But somehow, with Evelyn sitting across from him, making notes and calculations, it seemed less like a death sentence and more like a puzzle that might have a solution. "You should rest," Matthew said eventually. "It's been a long day, and tomorrow—" He cleared his throat. "Tomorrow's going to be busy." "The wedding," Evelyn said softly. "Yeah. Are you having second thoughts?" The question was gentle, giving him room to be honest. Matthew considered lying, then decided against it. They'd been honest with each other so far. No point in stopping now. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Scared that I'm pulling you into a disaster. Scared that everything you're planning won't be enough. Scared that I'm going to fail you the same way I've been failing this ranch." "Matthew." Evelyn reached across the table and took his hand the first time she'd touched him without gloves. Her skin was soft, but her grip was firm. "We're both scared. We're both taking a tremendous gamble on each other. But here's what I know, we're both fighters, we're both survivors, and we're both out of other options." She squeezed his hand. "So tomorrow we make our promises in front of God and the law, and then we fight like hell to keep them, together, as partners." "Partners," Matthew repeated, testing the word. "Equal partners," Evelyn emphasized. "Not master and servant, not protector and protected. Two people working toward the same goal with whatever skills and strengths we each bring." It was a strange idea, stranger than he'd expected when he'd written that advertisement, seeking a practical, hard-working wife. But looking at this refined Boston lady who'd arrived in her blue dress and impractical hair, who'd studied his books and seen solutions where he'd seen only ruin, who was willing to face down a banker and build drying racks and start over in the middle of nowhere, maybe he thought she was exactly what he needed after all. "Equal partners," he agreed. They said goodnight, then awkward and formal, both aware of the enormity of what they'd committed to. Matthew retreated to the barn where he'd made himself a rough bed in the loft, and through the small window he could see the lamp still burning in the cabin as Evelyn presumably unpacked and settled into her new home. Tomorrow they'd be married. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Matthew Kemp allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the Rocking K Ranch had a fighting chance at survival. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying the scent of dust and wild sage, and the promise of storms that never seemed to come. Matthew lay back on the hay hands behind his head, staring at the barn's dark rafters. "All right, Pa," he whispered to the ghost of his father wherever it might be. "I'm doing this your way, taking a risk, trusting someone new, refusing to give up. I hope to God it works." The darkness gave no answer. But then it never did. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky so clear it looked like polished glass. Matthew woke before dawn, as he always did, his body trained by years of ranch work to rise with the first hint of light. But this morning was different. This morning he lay there in the hay for a long moment, heart hammering against his ribs, wondering if Evelyn had changed her mind during the night. It wouldn't be unreasonable. She'd seen the ranch, now understood the depth of the problems they faced. A sensible woman would ask for the next coach back to civilization. But when he finally climbed down from the loft and approached the cabin, smoke was already rising from the chimney. Through the window he could see her moving around inside, and something in his chest loosened. She was still here. He knocked softly before entering. "Morning." Evelyn turned from the stove and Matthew actually stopped mid-step. She'd changed from the blue traveling dress into something simpler, a dove-gray dress with a high collar and long sleeves, proper but not ostentatious. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she looked somehow both more approachable and more beautiful than she had yesterday. "Good morning," she said, and there was only the slightest tremor in her voice. "I hope you don't mind. I found coffee in the cupboard and took the liberty of making some." "Mind God, no." Matthew moved to the table where she'd set out 2 tin cups. The coffee smelled like heaven. "I usually don't bother with it, except on Sundays." "Well, this seems like an occasion worth marking." She poured for both of them, her movements efficient. "I also found eggs in the hen house and made some breakfast. I hope that's all right." Matthew looked at the plate she'd set at his usual spot. Scrambled eggs, toasted bread, even a small jar of what looked like jam. His throat went tight. You didn't have to do all this. I wanted to. She sat down across from him, cradling her own cup. Besides, I needed something to do with my hands. I've been awake since 4, too nervous to sleep. You too. The admission slipped out before he could stop it. Me too. She smiled, and it was shaky but genuine. This is rather unconventional, isn't it, getting married to someone we met yesterday? Reckon people have done stranger things on the frontier. Matthew took a sip of coffee. It was perfect, strong, and hot, and exactly what he needed. But, yeah, it's unconventional. They ate in companionable silence, both of them dancing around the elephant in the room. Finally, as Matthew was finishing his eggs, Eveline set down her fork and looked at him directly. I want to be clear about something before we do this, she said. I know this marriage is primarily practical, a partnership as we discussed, but I also want you to know that I take my vows seriously. When I promise before God to honor and support you, I mean it. This isn't a performance for me. Matthew felt heat creep up his neck. I appreciate that, and I feel the same. I may have sent for a wife out of desperation, but I don't take the commitment lightly. When I make those promises to you today, they're real. Good. She nodded, satisfied. Then we understand each other. There's one more thing. Matthew said, the words coming hard. About the sleeping arrangements. Eveline's cheeks colored slightly. Yes. I know we talked about this being a partnership first, and I meant what I said about giving you privacy. But we'll be married in the eyes of the law and the church, and He struggled to find the right words. I don't want you to think I expect anything you're not ready to give. We can take this slow. As slow as you need. The relief on her face was palpable. Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. But I also don't want folks in town thinking this is some kind of sham arrangement, he continued. So in public, we should probably act like a proper married couple. Nothing excessive, just normal. I can do that. Eveline's voice was steadier now. And Matthew, for what it's worth, I do intend for this to be a real marriage. Eventually, when we're both ready, I just need time to adjust to everything that's changed. We've got time, Matthew said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true with the bank breathing down their necks. But this at least they could control. As much as you need. The church service was scheduled for 10 o'clock. They had 2 hours to get ready and make the ride into town. Matthew spent the time doing morning chores, feeding the cattle, checking the fences, mucking out the barn, partly because the work needed doing, and partly because he needed something to occupy his hands and mind. When he came back to the cabin to wash up and change into his one good suit, Eveline had transformed the space. She'd picked fresh wildflowers and arranged them in jars around the room. She'd laid out his suit brushed and ready. She'd even polished his boots, which he hadn't bothered with in months. You didn't have to do all this, he said, touched despite himself. I wanted the day to feel special, she said simply. Even if it's unconventional, it's still our wedding day. It should be marked. Matthew changed in the barn, giving her privacy to prepare. When he emerged 20 minutes later in his dark suit and cleanly shaven, his hair slicked back with water, he felt more presentable than he had in years. The suit was old, dating back to his father's funeral, but it still fit well enough. Eveline was waiting by the wagon, and the sight of her stole his breath completely. She'd changed into a dress he hadn't seen before, deep green like pine trees with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. It wasn't a traditional white wedding gown, but it was clearly special, clearly chosen with care. Her hair was arranged in soft waves with a few small white flowers tucked into the dark curls. She looked elegant and beautiful, and completely out of place against the backdrop of his dusty ranch. You look... Matthew cleared his throat, struggling. You look real pretty, Eveline. Thank you. She smoothed her skirt self-consciously. It's not what most brides wear, I know, but I thought white might be a bit presumptuous given the circumstances. And green has always been my favorite color. It's perfect, Matthew said, and meant it. He offered his arm. Shall we? The ride to town felt both endless and far too short. They didn't talk much, both caught up in their own thoughts. Matthew kept stealing glances at the woman beside him, this stranger who, in a matter of hours, would be his wife, and wondered what the hell he was doing. It wasn't too late to stop this. They could turn around, he could arrange for her to travel back east, They could pretend this whole mad scheme had never happened, but then she caught him looking and smiled, nervous but determined, and he knew neither of them was going to back out. They were both too stubborn, too desperate, too committed to survival to give up now. Pinecrest looked sleepy in the mid-morning sun. A few people were out on the street, and Matthew saw heads turn as they drove past. News of his mail-order bride had spread as news always did in small towns. He could practically feel the weight of their curiosity and judgment. They pulled up in front of the white-painted church just as the bell tower clock struck 10. Reverend Michaels was waiting on the steps, a kindly man in his 60s who'd known Matthew since childhood. "Matthew," he greeted, then turned to Evelyn with warm eyes. "And you must be Miss Hart. Welcome to Pinecrest." "Thank you, Reverend." Evelyn accepted his handshake with grace. "I appreciate you agreeing to perform the ceremony on such short notice." "Well, when Matthew sent word yesterday, I could hardly refuse." The Reverend's eyes twinkled. "Though I confess I was surprised. Matthew Kemp married. Never thought I'd see the day." "Neither did I," Matthew admitted. "Do we have witnesses?" Evelyn asked. "Ah," Matthew grimaced. In his preoccupation with everything else, he'd completely forgotten about that requirement. "I didn't arrange—" "I took the liberty," Reverend Michaels said. "Ask the Hendersons if they'd stand up for you. Hope that's all right." Tom and Sarah Henderson emerged from the church at that moment, and Matthew felt a rush of gratitude. The Hendersons ran the general store and had been friends with his father. They were good people, practical, and unpretentious. "Wouldn't miss it," Sarah said, moving to embrace Matthew. She was a stout woman in her 50s with a warm smile and sharp eyes. "About time you found someone to share that ranch with." She turned to Evelyn, assessing. "You must be brave, dear, coming all this way." "Or foolish," Evelyn said with surprising honesty. "I suppose we'll find out which." Sarah laughed, a rich, genuine sound. "I like her already, Matthew. She's honest." The ceremony was simple, conducted in the small church that smelled of old wood and candle wax. Sunlight streamed through the plain glass windows, throwing rectangles of light across the wooden pews. Matthew and Evelyn stood before the altar, facing each other, while Reverend Michaels opened his Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began, and his voice filled the empty space with warmth and authority. "We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Matthew barely heard the traditional words. He was too focused on Evelyn on the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the small bouquet of wildflowers Sarah had pressed into her grip, on the way her dark eyes stayed fixed on his face with an intensity that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," the Reverend continued, "but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." Matthew thought about those purposes. Companionship, support, building a life together. They were going into this for survival, yes, but maybe that was as good a foundation as romantic love. Maybe better, even more honest about what they needed from each other. "Matthew Kemp," Reverend Michaels said, pulling him back to the moment, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health? Until death do you part, for better, for worse. God, it was probably going to be worse before it got better, if it ever did." But looking at Evelyn, seeing the strength in her spine and the intelligence in her eyes, Matthew felt that dangerous hope stirring again. "I do," he said, and his voice came out stronger than he expected. "Evelyn Hart," the Reverend turned to her, "do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Evelyn's answer was immediate, clear, without hesitation. "I do." "The rings!" Matthew pulled out the simple gold band he'd bought yesterday with the last of his spare cash. It wasn't much, just a plain circle of metal, but it was all he could afford. He'd worried it would seem cheap to someone who'd grown up with wealth, but Evelyn's eyes lit up when she saw it. He took her left hand, small and soft, in his work-roughened palm, and slid the ring onto her finger. "With this ring, I thee wed." Evelyn had surprised him by producing her own ring, a simple band that had belonged to her mother, she'd explained quietly. Now she took his hand and slipped it onto his finger, her voice soft but steady. "With this ring I thee wed. By the power vested in me, by the territory of Nebraska, and by God Almighty." Reverend Michaels proclaimed, "I now pronounce you man and wife." He smiled. "Matthew, you may kiss your bride." This was the moment Matthew had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. He stepped closer to Evelyn, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. But she tilted her face up to his eyes, steady, granting permission. The kiss was brief, chaste, just a soft press of lips that lasted maybe 3 seconds. But something passed between them in that moment, a seal on the promises they'd made, an acknowledgement of the leap of faith they were both taking. When they pulled apart, Evelyn's cheeks were flushed and her breathing was slightly unsteady. Matthew's heart was hammering so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "Well then," Reverend Michaels said cheerfully, breaking the tension. "That's official. Mr. and Mrs. Matthew Kemp." Sarah Henderson applauded, and Tom shook Matthew's hand with genuine warmth. They signed the marriage certificate in the Reverend's office, making it legal in the eyes of both church and state. Matthew's signature was rough and blocky next to Evelyn's elegant script, but they looked right together on the page, 2 different styles creating something new. Outside the church, Sarah pulled Evelyn aside while Tom clapped Matthew on the shoulder. "You did it," Tom said quietly. "Took guts sending for a bride like that." "Took desperation, but," Matthew corrected. "Maybe, but look at her, Matthew. She's smart, I can see it in her eyes, and she's got backbone. She'll be good for you, I think." Matthew hoped Tom was right. God, how he hoped. Evelyn reappeared then, and Sarah gave Matthew a meaningful look. "I invited them for lunch at our place, but they declined. Said they had important business to attend to." "The bank," Matthew said grimly. "Ah." Tom's expression turned serious. "Still having trouble with Thornton." "You could say that. Well, if you need anything." "I appreciate it, Tom, but I think this is something we need to handle ourselves." They said their goodbyes and climbed back into the wagon. As they pulled away from the church, Evelyn sat up straighter, squaring her shoulders like someone preparing for battle. "Are you ready for this?" Matthew asked. "No," she admitted. "But we're doing it anyway." She turned to look at him. "Drop me at the bank. Then go to the general store or the saloon, anywhere but there. Give me 30 minutes. Evelyn, trust me, Matthew, please." It went against every instinct he had, but they'd just promised to be partners, to trust each other with their lives. If he couldn't let her try this her way, what was the point of any of it? 30 minutes, he agreed. Pinecrest Savings occupied a sturdy brick building on Main Street, the most substantial structure in town, aside from the church. Matthew pulled the wagon up in front, and Evelyn climbed down before he could help her. She smoothed her green dress, checked her hair, and took a deep breath. 30 minutes, she repeated. Then she walked through those doors with her head high and her spine straight, every inch the proper Boston lady. Matthew watched her go, his stomach churning with anxiety and something that might have been pride. Then he drove the wagon down to Henderson's store, tied up the horses, and tried to figure out how to kill 30 minutes without losing his mind. Inside Pinecrest Savings. Evelyn paused just past the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer interior. The bank was cool and quiet, with dark wood everywhere, and a faint smell of tobacco and paper. A young clerk sat at a desk near the front, and at the back, through an open door, she could see a larger office where a man sat behind an impressive mahogany desk. Ernest Thornton. It had to be. "May I help you, ma'am?" the clerk asked, standing politely. "I'm here to see Mr. Thornton." Evelyn kept her voice pleasant but firm. "Tell him Mrs. Matthew Kemp would like a few minutes of his time." The clerk blinked, clearly surprised. "Mrs. Kemp, I didn't know Matthew was—" "We were married this morning." She smiled. "So you can understand why I'd like to discuss certain matters with Mr. Thornton immediately." "I'll see if he's available." The clerk hurried to the back office. Evelyn used the moment to study her surroundings more carefully. The bank was prosperous but not ostentatious. The furnishings were quality but practical, the decorations minimal. This told her something about Thornton. He was successful but not wasteful, careful with money, even his own. That could work in her favor. "Mrs. Kemp," a voice called from the back office. "Please come in. Ernest Thornton stood as she entered, and Evelyn assessed him quickly. Mid-40s, well-dressed but not fancy, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a face that suggested he smiled rarely. His desk was meticulously organized papers in neat stacks, everything in its place. A careful man, a methodical man. Perfect. Mr. Thornton. Evelyn extended her hand, and after a moment's surprise, he shook it. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I confess I'm curious. Thornton gestured to the chair across from his desk. I didn't know Matthew Kemp was getting married. It was rather sudden. Evelyn sat arranging her skirts with deliberate care. I arrived from Boston 2 days ago. We were married this morning. Boston. Thornton's eyebrows rose. That's quite a journey. Yes, well, sometimes circumstances require bold action. She met his eyes directly. As I'm sure you understand being a businessman. Indeed. Thornton leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. So, Mrs. Kemp, what brings you to my office on your wedding day? Let's not waste time with pleasantries, Mr. Thornton. You know why I'm here. Evelyn pulled off her gloves with careful precision. You hold the mortgage on the Rocking K Ranch. My husband is 3.5 months behind on payments. You've threatened foreclosure. That's correct. If he was surprised by her directness, he didn't show it. Though I wouldn't say I've threatened foreclosure. I've simply informed Mr. Kemp of the consequences of continued non-payment. A distinction without a difference? Evelyn opened her bag and pulled out a folded paper, the calculations she'd worked on late into the previous night. May I be frank? Please? You don't want the Rocking K Ranch, Mr. Thornton. Foreclosing would be expensive and time-consuming. You'd have to hire someone to maintain the property, find a buyer in a terrible market, likely accept far less than the outstanding debt, all while the property continues to cost you money and generates no income. She unfolded her paper. By my calculations, foreclosure would cost you approximately $200 in immediate expenses with no guarantee of recouping your investment for at least a year. Thornton's expression hadn't changed, but she saw interest flicker in his eyes. You've done your homework. I believe in understanding the full scope of any financial situation. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. What you want, Mr. Thornton, is your money reliably, consistently, with minimal risk and effort. Am I correct? That is generally how banking works, yes. Then let me propose an alternative to foreclosure. She spread her paper on his desk. The Rocking K's current financial model is unsustainable. I won't insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise. A cattle operation dependent on rainfall and market prices that fluctuate wildly is too high risk, but the land has other assets that haven't been leveraged, such as an apple orchard that currently produces fruit that goes to waste, prairie grass that could be baled and sold, cottonwood lumber that could be harvested, the possibility of diversified crops if we can improve water management. She pointed to her figures. I've projected conservative revenue streams from each of these sources. Combined, they would generate enough income to support restructured loan payments. Thornton picked up the paper, studying her calculations with those sharp eyes. The silence stretched out, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Evelyn forced herself to sit still to project confidence, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. These projections assume optimal conditions, Thornton said finally. They assume reasonable conditions, Evelyn corrected. I've built in a 20% buffer for setbacks and unforeseen circumstances. These are conservative estimates, not fantasies, and you believe you and Matthew can execute on this plan. I know we can. Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. My father was Charles Hart of Hart Trading Company in Boston. Before his business was destroyed by false accusations, he taught me everything about commerce accounting and business strategy. I understand profit margins and risk management. Matthew understands the land and the work. Together we have the skills necessary to make this succeed. Charles Hart. Thornton's eyes narrowed. I remember reading about that scandal. Your father was accused of embezzlement. Accused and acquitted, Evelyn said firmly. The charges were politically motivated and ultimately proven false, but by then the damage was done. However, his accounting methods were never questioned. Everything I learned from him about financial management remained sound, and yet his business still failed. The words were like a knife, but Evelyn didn't flinch. His business failed because reputation is everything in Boston society, and once lost, it cannot be recovered. But here on the frontier, what matters is not reputation, but results. Give us the chance to produce those results, Mr. Thornton. What exactly are you proposing? This was it, the moment everything hinged on. Evelyn took a careful breath and laid out her terms. Restructure the loan with a 12-month grace period during which we pay interest only at 6%, not your current 8%. During that time, we implement the diversification strategy. At the end of 12 months, we resume principal payments on a revised schedule based on demonstrated income. If we default again, you foreclose with no further negotiation. But if we meet our obligations, you have a performing loan with reliable payments instead of a property you have to manage and sell. Thornton set down her paper and leaned back, his face unreadable. 6% is below market rate. 8% is above market rate for agricultural loans, Evelyn countered. 6% is standard. And consider this. Which would you prefer, a performing loan at 6% or a foreclosed property costing you money with no income? You make a compelling argument, Mrs. Kemp. Thornton drummed his fingers on the desk. But I have shareholders to answer to. They expect returns, not charity. This isn't charity. This is smart business. Evelyn pulled out one more paper. She'd saved this for last. I've also prepared a comparison analysis. Foreclosure scenario versus restructured loan scenario with all associated costs and projected returns over 3 years. The numbers clearly favor restructuring. She pushed the second paper across the desk. Thornton studied it, and she could see him doing the calculations in his head, weighing options, considering angles. This was a man who thought like her father had thought in terms of numbers and probabilities and logical outcomes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up. 5 months, he said. Excuse me. I'll give you 5 months of interest-only payments, not 12. If at the end of 5 months you can demonstrate sustainable income from these alternative sources, we'll discuss extending the arrangement. But I need to see results before committing to a full year. Evelyn's mind raced. 5 months was tight, very tight. The apples wouldn't even be ready to harvest until late September, giving them barely any time to prove the concept. But it was better than foreclosure. It was a chance. 7 months, she countered. That gives us through harvest season and allows time to establish the full diversification strategy. 6 months. Final offer. 6 months. It would be brutally difficult but possible if everything went right. And more importantly, it was an agreement. It was hope. 6 months, Evelyn agreed. With the interest rate reduced to 6%. 6.5%. Done. She extended her hand across the desk. Do we have an agreement, Mr. Thornton? He studied her for a long moment, and she couldn't read his expression. Then slowly, he reached out and shook her hand. We have an agreement, Mrs. Kemp. I'll have my clerk draw up the revised loan terms. You and Matthew can come back tomorrow to sign the paperwork. Relief flooded through Evelyn so powerfully she felt dizzy, but she kept her face composed, her handshake firm. Thank you, Mr. Thornton. You won't regret this. I certainly hope not. He released her hand. For all our sakes. Evelyn stood gathering her papers with hands that wanted to shake. One more thing, if I may. Yes. I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention to others how this arrangement came about. My husband is a proud man, and he might not appreciate everyone knowing that his new wife negotiated with the bank on his behalf. Something that might have been respect flickered across Thornton's face. Your secret is safe, Mrs. Kemp. As far as anyone else needs to know, Matthew came to me with a solid business plan, and we reached an agreement. Thank you. She walked out of that office with her head high through the bank lobby, out into the brilliant Nebraska sunshine. The moment she was clear of the building, her knees went weak. She leaned against the brick wall, breathing hard, letting the magnitude of what had just happened wash over her. They had 6 months. 6 months to save the ranch, to prove themselves, to build something sustainable from the wreckage of Matthew's dreams and her own desperate flight from Boston. It was terrifying. It was barely enough time. But it was a chance. Evelyn... She looked up to find Matthew striding toward her, his face tight with anxiety. He must have been watching from somewhere nearby, unable to stay away despite his promise. Well, he asked, and his voice was rough with tension. What happened? Eveline straightened, smoothed her skirts, and allowed herself to smile, really smile, for the first time since she'd arrived in Nebraska. "We have 6 months," she said. "Interest-only payments at 6.5%. If we can prove sustainable income by then, he'll extend the arrangement. If we can't, he forecloses," Matthew finished. "Yes." 6 months. He ran a hand through his hair, disheveling it. "God, Evelyn, I don't know if we can do this, Matthew." She moved toward him, taking his hands in hers, right there on Main Street, where anyone could see she held onto him like an anchor. "We have to do this, and we will." He stared down at her, and she saw fear and hope and something else warring in his eyes. Then suddenly he pulled her into his arms, hugging her tight, enough that she could barely breathe. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "Christ, Evelyn, thank you." She held him back just as tightly, feeling the solid reality of him, the strength still left in this man who'd been fighting alone for so long. They stood there on the dusty street, a newly married couple clinging to each other and the fragile hope they'd managed to secure. When they finally pulled apart, Matthew's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Come on," he said, his voice rough. "Let's go home. We've got work to do." They drove back to the ranch in a daze, the magnitude of everything settling over them like dust after a storm. Married, negotiated, 6 months to save everything or lose it all. "Tell me exactly what he said," Matthew requested as the familiar landscape rolled past. "Every word." Evelyn recounted the conversation, watching his face as she described her arguments, Thornton's counters, the final agreement. When she finished, Matthew was shaking his head in wonder. "You walked in there and did in 30 minutes what I couldn't do in 3 years of groveling," he said. "How I spoke his language, and I gave him what he actually wanted, not what he was demanding, but what he truly wanted. Security profit, minimal risk. Everything else was just negotiation." "Where did you learn to do that?" "My father." Evelyn's voice softened. "He used to say that most business disputes happen because people argue over positions instead of interests. If you can identify what someone truly needs and offer them a path to it, they'll usually deal with you, even if they don't particularly like you. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man." "He was." She looked out at the endless prairie. "Flawed, certainly, proud to a fault, but brilliant in his way. I just wish—" She trailed off. "What? I wish he could have seen this, could have known that what he taught me mattered, that it helped save something important." She brushed at her eyes impatiently. "Sorry, today has been rather emotional." "You're allowed to be emotional on your wedding day," Matthew said gently, "even if it's not a conventional one." They reached the ranch as the sun began its afternoon descent, painting everything in gold and amber light. The place looked different somehow, not better exactly, but more like possibility and less like defeat. Or maybe that was just Evelyn's relief talking. "So," Matthew said as they climbed down from the wagon, 6 months. Where do we start?" Evelyn looked around at the ranch, at the overgrown orchard and the broken fences and the dried creek bed and all the work that lay ahead of them. It was overwhelming. It was impossible. It was theirs to save or lose. "We start with the orchard," she said firmly. "The apples will be our first revenue stream. That means we need to assess the trees, build drying racks, and prepare for harvest. Can you show me what we're working with? Now it's your wedding day. And we have 6 months to save our home." She met his eyes. "I didn't come here to be decorative, Matthew. I came here to work, so let's work." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right then, let's go see what we've got." They walked together toward the orchard, two people bound by vows and desperation, and the slim thread of hope, ready to fight for something neither of them could afford to lose. The future was uncertain. The odds were terrible. But for the first time in a long time, both of them felt like maybe they had a fighting chance. The orchard sprawled across 3 acres on the eastern edge of the property, where the land sloped gently toward what had once been a reliable creek. Matthew's father had planted it 15 years ago with dreams of supplemental income, but time and neglect had turned it half wild. Apple trees grew in crooked rows, their branches tangled and unpruned, competing with prairie grass and wild shrubs for dominance. Evelyn walked among the trees slowly, her green wedding dress catching on low branches as she examined each one with careful attention. Matthew followed, watching her work with a mixture of curiosity and something close to admiration. She didn't just glance at the trees, she studied them, running her hands over the bark, checking the leaves for disease, peering up into the canopy to assess the developing fruit. "These are mostly late-season varieties," she said more to herself than to him. "Golden russet here, and this looks like a wolf river. These two are definitely Rome beauties. See the distinctive shape." She moved to another cluster. "The good news is, they're all varieties that dry well. The bad news is they've been neglected for years." "Can you tell how much fruit we'll get?" Matthew asked. Eveline tilted her head, calculating. "If we're lucky, maybe 15 to 20 bushels of usable apples. Some of these trees are so overgrown they're bearing poorly, and I can see evidence of pest damage on several, but it's workable." She turned to face him, and there was dirt on her dress, now leaves in her hair. She looked more real than she had in the church that morning, more like she belonged here. "We need to do some emergency pruning to improve air circulation and light penetration. Not a full pruning, it's the wrong season for that, but enough to give the developing fruit a better chance." "I don't know anything about pruning fruit trees," Matthew admitted. "I do. My mother had an extensive garden and she taught me the basics. The principles are sound." Evelyn started walking again, her mind clearly working through problems and solutions. "We'll also need to clear the ground cover around the base of each tree, which will make harvest easier and reduce pest habitat. Then we need to start building drying racks, simple wooden frames with cheesecloth or muslin stretched across them. The apples need to be sliced thin, arranged in a single layer, and dried in the sun for several days." Matthew tried to envision it all, that work, all those steps accomplished in the narrow window they had. "How long will this take?" "The preparation 2 weeks if we work hard. The harvest itself will be maybe 3 days of intense labor. The drying will take a week or more depending on weather." She paused beside a particularly gnarled tree, tracing a pattern in the bark. "Then we need to package everything properly, clean cloth bags sealed tight to prevent moisture and pests. And we need to start making contacts with potential buyers now before harvest, so we have markets lined up. The wagon trains don't come through until late September," Matthew said. "Then we sell to merchants in town who supply the trains, or directly to mining operations or to military posts. There are options, Matthew. We just need to be creative and persistent." She looked at him over her shoulder, her expression determined. "This is going to work, but it requires us both committing fully. No half measures." "I'm committed," Matthew said, and realized he meant it. "Tell me what you need." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the orchard with Evelyn directing and Matthew following her instructions. She showed him which branches to cut the dead ones first, then those growing inward or crossing badly, while she worked beside him with surprising vigor. The refined Boston lady disappeared entirely as she climbed partway up a ladder he'd retrieved from the barn. Her sleeves rolled up, wielding pruning shears with confident precision. "You're good at this," Matthew observed, hauling away an armful of cut branches. "I'm good at many things people don't expect," Evelyn replied without looking down. "That's been both a blessing and a curse in my life." "How so?" She paused in her cutting, considering. "My father raised me almost like a son in many ways. He had no male heir, so he poured all his knowledge into me: business, mathematics, strategy, negotiation. I loved learning it, excelled at it. But in Boston society, intelligent women are curiosities at best and threats at worst. I was educated, but expected to be decorative. Capable, but supposed to defer to male authority. It was suffocating." "Sounds lonely," Matthew said quietly. "It was. After the scandal, it got worse. I became something to pity or avoid depending on the day. The women who'd once called themselves my friends suddenly had no time for me. The men who'd once paid court disappeared like smoke." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Matthew heard the pain underneath. "So when I saw your advertisement, practical, honest, needing a partner rather than a decoration, it felt like an answer to prayers I hadn't known how to pray." Matthew climbed up the ladder beside her, close enough to smell the faint lavender scent that clung to her hair. "I'm glad you answered, even if I didn't know what I was getting." She turned to look at him, and they were face to face on the ladder, close enough that he could see gold flecks in her dark eyes. "Are you disappointed?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. Confused, maybe. Overwhelmed, definitely, but not disappointed. He reached out and plucked a leaf from her hair, holding it up with a small smile. "You're full of surprises, Eveline Kemp." She blinked at the name, her new name, and something shifted in her expression. "So are you Matthew Kemp?" I expected someone broken down by defeat. Instead, I found someone still fighting. "Fighting's all I know how to do." "Then we're well matched." She handed him the pruning shears. "Here, your turn. Cut that branch there, the one angling back toward the trunk." "Yes, that one. Clean cut close to the collar." They worked until the sun touched the horizon, transforming the sky into ribbons of orange and crimson. By then they'd pruned 20 trees and cleared the ground around their bases, making visible progress through the orchard. Matthew's shoulders ached and his hands were blistered, but it was good work, purposeful work. Work that might actually save them. As they walked back toward the cabin through the gathering dusk, Eveline stumbled slightly on the uneven ground. Matthew caught her elbow, steadying her, and they both froze, suddenly aware of the contact, of the intimacy that had been growing between them all day without either noticing. "Thank you," Eveline said softly, not pulling away. "You worked hard today." Matthew set his hand still on her arm. "Too hard for your first full day here." "I worked exactly as hard as necessary." But she was swaying slightly with exhaustion. He could feel it. "Though I confess, I'll be glad to sit down." "Come on." He shifted his grip to her waist, supporting her more substantially. "Let's get you inside." The cabin felt different when they entered, warmer, somehow more lived in. Eveline's small touches from that morning were still visible: the wildflowers on the table, the swept floor, the clean dishes stacked neatly. It looked less like a bachelor's desperate quarters and more like a home. "I should make dinner," Eveline said, but she was already sinking into one of the chairs. "You should rest. I can handle dinner." Matthew moved to the stove, grateful that he'd at least learned basic cooking over the past 3 years. "Nothing fancy, but I make a decent stew." "Matthew, I'm supposed to—" "We're partners, remember? That means we both do what needs doing, regardless of whose traditional job it is." He started pulling out ingredients: salt, pork, dried beans he'd soaked that morning, an onion from the root cellar. "You negotiated with the bank and pruned trees all day. I can manage to heat up food." He felt her watching him as he worked, and the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. Outside, the prairie night sounds began: crickets chirping, a distant owl, calling, the wind moving through the dry grass like whispered secrets. "Tell me about your father," Eveline said eventually. "You've heard my story. I'd like to hear yours." Matthew stirred the pot, considering how much to share. He was stubborn, determined, believed that hard work and integrity would see you through anything. When he came here 20 years ago, this was all open prairie. He built everything from nothing: the cabin, the barn, the fences, the orchard. He had a vision of what this place could be. And he passed that vision to you, for better or worse. Matthew's throat tightened. He died 3 winters ago. Heart attack during a blizzard. I found him in the barn the next morning. He'd been checking on the cattle, making sure they were safe and fed, and his heart just stopped. "I'm so sorry." He died doing what he loved, at least, taking care of his land, his animals. There are worse ways to go. Matthew tasted the stew, adjusted the salt. But it left me alone here trying to keep his dream alive when I wasn't sure I had the strength or the knowledge to do it. I've been failing him for 3 years, Eveline, slowly losing everything he built. You haven't lost it yet. Only because you showed up. He turned to face her. I want to be clear about that. Without you, I'd be done in 3 weeks. Thornton would foreclose, I'd lose the ranch, and my father's legacy would disappear like it never existed. Eveline stood and moved to where he stood by the stove. Then we won't let that happen. We'll honor both our fathers by succeeding where they couldn't, by proving that their teachings and their sacrifices mattered. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his rough cheek. Matthew closed his eyes, leaning into the contact, feeling something crack open inside him, all the loneliness and fear and exhaustion he'd been carrying for so long. I'm scared, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. So am I. But we're scared together now. That has to count for something. They stood there in the dim cabin, two damaged people holding on to each other and hoping it would be enough. Then the stew began to bubble over, breaking the moment, and they both laughed, slightly hysterical. Tension-releasing laughter that felt dangerously close to tears. Dinner was simple, but filling, eaten at the rough table with a single candle between them. They talked about practical things, what supplies they'd need from town, how to construct the drying racks, which merchants might be interested in their dried apples. But underneath the practical conversation, something else was happening. They were learning each other's rhythms, the way their minds worked, how to communicate without words. After dinner, Evelyn insisted on cleaning up despite Matthew's protests. He let her, recognizing that she needed to contribute to feel useful. Instead, he sat at the table with the ledger, making notes about their new plan, calculating costs and potential revenues with more hope than he'd felt in years. "We need to name our enterprise," Evelyn said as she dried the last dish. "What do you mean?" "If we're going to approach merchants about dried apples and other products, we need something more official than Matthew's Ranch, something that sounds established and trustworthy." She hung the dish towel to dry. "What about Kemp Provisions or Rocking K Specialty Goods? That sounds awfully grand for two people and some apples." "Perception matters in business, Matthew. We need to present ourselves as serious merchants, not desperate farmers." She came to sit across from him. "Besides, if this works when this works, we'll expand. Other products, other income streams. We need a name that can grow with us." Matthew considered it, rolling the words around in his mind. "Hart Kemp Provisions," he said slowly. Evelyn's eyes widened. "You want to include my name? You're the one who made this possible. Seems only fair." He met her gaze across the table. "Besides, your father taught you everything you know about business. Using his name honors that. Hart Kemp Provisions. Has a good ring to it." She looked away quickly, but not before he saw her eyes go bright with unshed tears. "He would have liked that," she said, voice thick. "Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Evelyn, for saving us." The evening stretched on both of them, reluctant to address the elephant in the room, the sleeping arrangements. Finally, as the candle burned low, Matthew stood. "I should let you get some rest," he said. "I'll head out to the barn." "No." Evelyn's voice was quiet but firm. "What?" "We're married, Matthew, legally and before God. I won't have you sleeping in the barn like some unwanted stranger." She stood as well, smoothing her skirts nervously. "The bed is large enough for two people to sleep without anything inappropriate. We can hang a blanket down the middle if you're more comfortable, but I won't begin this marriage by banishing you from your own bed." Matthew's heart was suddenly hammering. "Evelyn, I don't want you to feel pressured. I don't." She moved closer, looking up at him with those steady, dark eyes. "I trust you, Matthew. You've been nothing but respectful since I arrived. I know you won't push for more than I'm ready to give, but we're partners, and partners don't make one sleep in a barn." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She managed a small smile. "Besides, it's practical. You need proper rest if you're going to work hard tomorrow, and I'll feel safer knowing you're nearby rather than across the yard." So Matthew found himself an hour later lying in his own bed for the first time in weeks, acutely aware of the woman sleeping on the other side, separated by a careful distance and several layers of blankets, but undeniably present. He could hear her breathing, soft and steady, could smell that faint lavender scent, could feel the slight shift of the mattress when she moved. It was the most intimate thing he'd experienced in years, and they weren't even touching. "Matthew," her voice came through the darkness. "Yeah. Thank you for today, for trusting me with the bank, for listening to my ideas, for—" She paused. "For treating me like an equal." "You are an equal, Evelyn. More than equal, maybe. You've accomplished more in 2 days than I managed in 3 years. We've accomplished it together. That's the difference." She was quiet for a moment. "Good night, Matthew." "Good night, Evelyn." He lay awake long after her breathing deepened into sleep, staring at the dark ceiling and marveling at how completely his life had transformed in 48 hours. He'd sent for a wife out of desperation, expecting someone sturdy and practical. Instead, he'd gotten someone brilliant and determined and utterly unexpected, someone who just might save them both. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of relentless work. They fell into a rhythm, quickly rising before dawn and working until darkness forced them to stop. Matthew handled the heavy labor building, drying racks from scrap lumber, repairing the wagon, clearing more of the orchard, while Evelyn managed the details, the planning, the calculations that would make the difference between success and failure. But those divisions blurred constantly. Evelyn proved stronger than she looked, hauling water and hammering nails alongside him. Matthew discovered he had a knack for the meticulous work she needed, sorting apples, preparing packaging materials, keeping careful inventory records under her instruction. They learned to work together, to anticipate each other's needs, to communicate in shorthand. When Matthew saw Evelyn's shoulders tighten with stress, he'd make her stop for water and a few minutes of rest. When Matthew pushed himself too hard, ignoring his exhausted body, Evelyn would quietly take over his task until he recovered. The intimacy of marriage crept up on them gradually. Matthew stopped sleeping with a careful distance between them, and Evelyn stopped waking with rigid tension when she found herself pressed against his shoulder. They began touching casually, a hand on an arm, a steadying grip, small gestures that meant nothing and everything. One morning, Matthew woke to find Evelyn curled against his side, her head on his chest, sleeping peacefully. He should have moved, should have maintained the careful boundaries they'd established. Instead, he lay still, one arm coming up almost unconsciously to hold her closer and watch the sunrise through the small window while listening to her breathe. When she woke, she stiffened for just a moment, then relaxed deliberately. Neither of them acknowledged it. They simply got up and started another day of work. But something had shifted between them. "We need to go to town," Evelyn announced one morning over breakfast. "Today, if possible." "What for?" "We need to start making contacts with merchants. Building relationships now means we'll have buyers ready when the harvest comes." She pulled out a list she'd been compiling. "I want to talk to Henderson at the general store, the hotel owner, anyone who might have connections to wagon trains or military buyers." Matthew felt his stomach clench. "Evelyn, these people, they know me. They know I've been struggling, walking in there with grand plans about dried apples." "You won't be walking in with grand plans. We will be, together, as Hart Kemp Provisions." She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "Trust me, Matthew. I know how to do this." So they went to town, Matthew in his cleanest shirt and Evelyn in a practical blue dress that somehow still managed to look elegant. They stopped first at Henderson's store, where Tom greeted them warmly. "Matthew, Evelyn, how's married life treating you?" "Busy," Matthew admitted. "We've been working the orchard, getting ready for harvest." "That old orchard?" Tom looked surprised. "I didn't think those trees still produced much." "They produce more than you'd think," Evelyn said smoothly. "We're planning to process the apples into dried goods, shelf-stable, high-quality, perfect for travelers or anyone needing provisions that will keep. We were hoping you might be interested in carrying them in your store." Tom scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Dried apples fetch a good price when they are available. The wagon trains especially want them. But I'd need to see the product first, make sure the quality is there." "Of course." Evelyn's smile was professional, confident. "We'll bring you samples as soon as the first batch is processed. And Tom, I wanted to ask, do you have contacts with any of the wagon masters who come through? We'd like to offer bulk pricing for larger orders." "I know a few. Old Bill Westmore especially. He runs provisions for several trains each season. I could introduce you when he comes through next month." "That would be wonderful, thank you." They moved through town like that, with Evelyn leading conversations and Matthew backing her up, presenting themselves as a united front. At the hotel, they secured interest from the owner, who needed provisions for his kitchen. At the telegraph office, they learned about a new mining camp 40 miles west that might need suppliers. By the time they stopped for lunch at the small restaurant near the church, they had 3 confirmed interested buyers and several promising leads. "You're a natural at this," Matthew said, watching Evelyn make notes in the small book she'd started carrying. "It's just conversation and common sense," she replied, but she was pleased he could tell. "People want to do business with people they trust, who seem competent and reliable. We just need to project that image until it becomes reality." "It already is reality." Matthew reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We're making this work, Evelyn. Really work. She looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, and something warm and complicated passed between them. "Yes," she said softly. "We are." They were interrupted by Ernest Thornton entering the restaurant. The banker spotted them immediately and approached their table. "Matthew, Mrs. Kemp." His voice was cordial but neutral. "I trust everything is proceeding well." "Very well, thank you," Evelyn said. "We've been implementing the diversification strategy we discussed. The orchard is coming along nicely." "I'm glad to hear it." Thornton glanced between them, and Matthew could see him reassessing, recalculating. "I confess I didn't expect to see results so quickly." "We're motivated," Matthew said dryly. "Indeed." Thornton nodded. "Well, I wish you continued success. Stop by the bank tomorrow to sign those revised loan documents we discussed." After he left, Matthew let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He seems less hostile. He's a businessman. Now that he sees we're serious, we become less of a problem and more of a potentially profitable relationship. Evelyn returned to her notes. "We need to keep surprising people, Matthew. Keep exceeding expectations. That's how we change the narrative from failing ranch to promising enterprise." The signing at the bank the next day was mercifully straightforward. Thornton had his clerk prepare the documents exactly as discussed, 6 months of interest-only payments at 6.5%, with a review at the end to determine if the arrangement would continue based on demonstrated income. Matthew signed with a shaking hand, still barely believing this was real. Evelyn signed beside him, her signature neat and authoritative, and just like that, they had their reprieve. Walking out of the bank, Matthew felt something he'd almost forgotten: lightness. Hope that didn't feel quite so fragile. "We did it," he said as they climbed into the wagon. "We bought ourselves time," Evelyn corrected. "Now comes the hard part, actually delivering on our promises." The apples ripened slowly through late August and early September, swelling on the branches and taking on the rich colors that signaled approaching harvest. Matthew and Evelyn checked the orchard daily, watching for the signs Evelyn had taught him, the way the fruit detached easily from the branch, the sweetness of the flesh, the proper firmness for drying. "Another week," Evelyn declared one evening, standing among the trees in the golden light. "Then we harvest." They'd prepared everything they could. The drying racks stood ready, built sturdy and level. They'd procured muslin from Henderson's store, purchased on credit against future sales. The storage area and the barn had been cleaned and organized. They'd practiced the process with a few early apples, perfecting their technique for slicing and arranging. They were as ready as they'd ever be. The night before harvest, Matthew found Evelyn sitting outside on the cabin steps, staring at the stars. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Too much thinking." She leaned against him slightly, a gesture that had become natural over the past weeks. "What if the apples don't dry properly? What if we lose half to spoilage? What if the quality isn't good enough and no one wants to buy them?" "Then we'll figure something else out. We always do." Matthew put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer. "You know what I've learned these past weeks?" "What?" "That I don't have to carry everything alone anymore. That having a partner, a real partner, changes everything." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, surprising himself with the gesture. "Whatever happens with this harvest, Evelyn, we're in it together. That makes me less afraid than I've been in years." She tilted her face up to his, and in the starlight, her eyes were luminous. "Matthew Kemp, you're dangerously close to being romantic." "Maybe I am." He touched her cheek gently. "You've changed everything for me, you know. Not just the ranch. Everything. You've changed things for me, too." Her voice was soft, almost wondering. "I came here running from failure, expecting nothing but hard work and survival. Instead, I found—" She trailed off. "What?" "A home. A purpose. A partner who sees me as I am and values it." She leaned in closer, her breath warm against his skin. "And maybe something more than partnership." Matthew's heart stuttered. "Evelyn, I know we agreed to take things slowly, and I still want that. But I also want you to know that this is becoming real for me. Not just a business arrangement or a marriage of convenience, something true." He cupped her face in both hands, thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "It's real for me, too. Has been for a while now, if I'm honest. They kissed then, slow and sweet, under the infinite prairie stars, and it felt like a promise they were both finally ready to make. When they pulled apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "We should get some rest," Evelyn whispered. "Big day tomorrow." "Yeah." But neither of them moved content to sit together in the darkness, holding on to each other and the hope they'd built together. Tomorrow, they'd harvest. Tomorrow, they'd take the first real step toward proving their plan could work. Tomorrow, everything they'd been fighting for would face its first true test. But tonight they had each other, and the stars, and the fierce determination that had carried them this far. It would have to be enough. Dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of September morning that promised a hot afternoon, but started with frost sparkling on the prairie grass. Matthew woke to find Evelyn already up, dressed in her oldest work clothes, her hair braided severely back. She was packing food and water into baskets, moving with the efficient precision that had become familiar to him over the past weeks. "Ready?" she asked, glancing at him as he pulled on his boots. "As I'll ever be." They walked to the orchard together through the misty morning, their breath visible in the cold air. The trees stood waiting, branches heavy with fruit that had ripened to perfection overnight, as if nature itself had decided to cooperate with their desperate timeline. The apples hung red and gold in the early light, more abundant than Matthew had dared to hope. "It's beautiful," Evelyn breathed, stopping at the edge of the orchard. "Matthew, look at them all." He did look, and for the first time in years, he saw his father's vision realized. This was what the old man had dreamed of when he planted these trees, not just fruit, but abundance possibility, a future built from the land's generosity. Matthew felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Pa would be proud," he said quietly. Evelyn took his hand, squeezing it. "He would be. And we're going to make this work. For him, for us, for everyone who believed this land was worth fighting for." They started in the southeast corner, working systematically through the rows. Matthew climbed the ladders and picked the high fruit, while Evelyn worked the lower branches, both of them filling baskets with careful efficiency. They'd learned during their practice runs that bruised apples dried poorly, so every piece of fruit was handled like precious cargo. The work was backbreaking. By mid-morning, Matthew's shoulders ached and his hands were sticky with apple juice. Evelyn's face was flushed from exertion, her braid coming loose to frame her face in wisps. But they kept working, driven by the knowledge that every apple they harvested was another small step toward salvation. "Tell me again how many pounds we need," Matthew called down from his ladder. "If we can get 50 pounds of dried apples, that's approximately 300 pounds of fresh fruit, accounting for moisture loss and waste." Evelyn was doing calculations in her head even as she picked. At current prices, 50 pounds should generate enough revenue for 2 mortgage payments, plus money for winter supplies. "And how much do you think we'll actually get?" She looked around at the laden trees, the baskets already filling up. "If we're lucky and the weather holds, maybe 70 or 80 pounds dried, possibly more." Hope surged through Matthew's chest, dangerous and intoxicating. That would change everything. "Don't count it until it's sold," Evelyn warned, but she was smiling. "We still have to process it all, dry it properly, package it, and find buyers. But yes, if everything goes right, it could change everything." They worked through the heat of the day, stopping only briefly for water and the sandwiches Evelyn had prepared. By late afternoon, they'd harvested 20 bushels of prime apples, with perhaps 10 more to go. Matthew's hands were raw and his back screamed protest with every movement, but he couldn't remember the last time work had felt this satisfying. As the sun began its descent, casting the orchard in amber light, they heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Matthew climbed down from his ladder, instantly wary. They weren't expecting anyone. Tom Henderson appeared around the barn driving his delivery wagon. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he called out cheerfully. "Tom." Matthew wiped his hands on his pants. "What brings you out here, Bo?" "Heard through the grapevine you folks were harvesting today. Thought you might could use some help." He gestured to the wagon bed where his teenage son sat. "Jake here's strong as an ox and has nothing but time. Figured we'd lend a hand." Matthew glanced at Evelyn, who looked as surprised as he felt. "Tom, that's generous, but we can't afford to pay." "Who said anything about pay?" Tom climbed down, his son following. "You helped me repair my storehouse roof last spring, remember? Spent 3 days up there in the heat. Figure I owe you. Besides," he grinned, I've got a business interest in you folks succeeding now, don't I? Can't sell your dried apples if you don't get them harvested. Emotion welled up in Matthew's chest, unexpected and overwhelming. He'd been alone for so long, fighting every battle by himself, that he'd forgotten what community felt like. Thank you, Tom. Truly. Don't mention it. Now, where do you want us? With 4 of them working, the remaining harvest went quickly. Jake proved to be exactly as strong as his father promised, hauling loaded baskets that made Matthew's arms burn just watching. Tom worked with the easy efficiency of a man who'd spent his life doing physical labor, and his presence somehow made the whole enterprise feel more real, more legitimate. As they worked, Tom asked questions about their business plan, their processing method, their target markets. Evelyn answered with confidence, outlining their strategy in terms that made it sound not just viable, but inevitable. Matthew watched Tom's expression shift from polite interest to genuine respect. "You've really thought this through," Tom said, setting down a full basket. "This isn't just some desperate scramble. This is actual business planning." "Desperation can be an excellent motivator for thorough planning," Evelyn said with a slight smile. "But yes, we've tried to approach this systematically. The dried apples are just the beginning. We're already planning to harvest prairie grass for baling, investigate the cottonwood timber, possibly establish a small vegetable operation for next spring." Diversification. Tom nodded approvingly. "Smart. Too many folks out here put all their hopes on one thing, then fold when it fails. You're building something sustainable." "We're trying," Matthew said. "Whether we're succeeding remains to be seen." "You're succeeding," Tom said firmly. "I've been in business long enough to recognize it when I see it. You've got something here, Matthew. Both of you do." By the time the sun touched the horizon, they'd harvested every ripe apple in the orchard. 30 bushels total, more than Matthew had thought possible. The baskets filled the barn, a small mountain of red and gold fruit that represented hope in its most tangible form. "I'll be back tomorrow to help with the processing," Tom said as he and Jake prepared to leave. "Sarah too, probably. She's got experience with preserving and drying. Won't take no for an answer, so don't bother trying." After they left, Matthew and Evelyn stood in the barn, surveying their harvest in the fading light. They were both exhausted, covered in dirt and sweat and apple juice, but neither wanted to move yet. This moment felt too important to rush past. "We did it," Evelyn said softly. "Step 1 complete." "Thanks to you," Matthew turned to face her. "None of this would exist without you. The plan, the negotiation with Thornton, the business contacts. You made all of this possible." "We made it possible," she corrected, moving closer. "You worked just as hard. You trusted me when you had no reason to. You were willing to try something new instead of clinging to what hadn't worked." She reached up, touching his face gently. "We're a good team, Matthew Kemp. The best team I've ever been part of." He pulled her close, no longer caring about propriety or careful boundaries. They were past that now, had been for weeks. "I love you, Evelyn. I know that's probably too soon to say, and I know this started as something practical, but I love you too." She cut him off with a kiss that tasted of apples and promise. "I think I started falling for you that first night when you sat across from me with that ledger and let me see all your vulnerabilities without shame. You're brave and stubborn and so determined to honor your father's legacy. How could I not love you?" They stood there in the barn holding each other while the last light faded, 2 people who'd gambled everything on each other and were beginning to see it pay off. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more steps on the long road to security. But tonight they had this moment, this small victory, this truth finally spoken aloud. The next morning brought Sarah Henderson, as promised, along with 2 other women from town. Mary Sullivan, whose husband ran the livery, and Elizabeth Wright, the minister's wife. They arrived with their own knives and aprons ready to work. "Heard you could use experienced hands," Sarah said briskly, already rolling up her sleeves. "We've all done our share of preserving. Just tell us what you need." What followed was 3 days of intense coordinated labor, unlike anything Matthew had experienced. The women worked with Evelyn to slice the apples with precise uniformity, thin enough to dry quickly, thick enough to maintain substance. Matthew and Tom, who returned as promised, handled the heavy work of moving the prepared fruit to the drying rack, setting them up in the full sun, covering them with muslin to protect from insects while allowing air circulation. The work became almost meditative, everyone falling into rhythm together. As they worked, they talked about the town, about the challenges of frontier life, about dreams and disappointments. Matthew learned that Mary's husband was struggling with the livery business, that Elizabeth worried constantly about the church's dwindling congregation, that Sarah had buried 2 children before Jake was born, and still woke sometimes thinking she heard them crying. In sharing their stories, they were welcomed into the community in a way Matthew had never been, even after living here for years. He realized with some surprise that he'd been so focused on his own struggles that he'd isolated himself, pushing away the support that had been available all along. "You should have asked for help sooner," Sarah told him, as they carried another rack of sliced apples into position. "We're not monsters, Matthew. Most folks around here remember your father fondly and would have been glad to pitch in." "I was too proud," Matthew admitted. "Thought asking for help was the same as admitting defeat." "Pride's a luxury we can't afford on the frontier," Sarah said bluntly. "We survive by helping each other. That's just how it works." Evelyn fit into the group of women like she'd been born to it, despite her Boston breeding and refined manners. She worked as hard as anyone, never complained, and contributed to the conversations with intelligence and humor that won everyone over. By the end of the first day, Mary was asking her advice about managing the livery books, and Elizabeth was seeking her opinion on fundraising ideas for the church. "Your wife is remarkable," Tom told Matthew as they took a water break. "Never seen someone adapt to frontier life so quickly." "She's tougher than she looks," Matthew agreed, watching Evelyn demonstrate proper knife technique to Mary. "Turns out what I needed wasn't someone who already knew ranch life. I needed someone willing to learn, willing to fight, willing to see possibilities where I only saw problems. You're lucky you found each other." "Don't I know it?" The drying process was agonizingly slow, requiring constant monitoring. They had to rotate the racks for even exposure, cover them at night to prevent dew damage, check constantly for signs of mold or spoilage. The weather remained mercifully clear, hot, dry September days that were perfect for drying fruit but made the work exhausting. On the 3rd evening, as they were covering the last racks for the night, Evelyn suddenly swayed on her feet. Matthew caught her before she could fall, feeling how warm her skin was. "I'm fine," she protested weakly. "Just tired." "You're not fine. You're burning up." Matthew swept her into his arms, ignoring her protests. "Sarah, I need help." Sarah appeared immediately, taking one look at Evelyn's flushed face and glassy eyes. "Heat exhaustion, most likely. Get her inside out of the sun. I'll bring water and cool cloths." Matthew carried Evelyn into the cabin, laying her on their bed with hands that shook. She'd been pushing herself too hard, he realized, with sick guilt. Working from dawn until after dark, refusing to rest, determined to prove she could handle frontier life. And he'd been so focused on the harvest that he hadn't noticed how much it was costing her. "Matthew," her voice was faint, confused. "The apples. The apples are fine. You're what matters." He brushed sweat-dampened hair from her forehead. "Why didn't you tell me you weren't feeling well?" "We couldn't afford to stop. Too much work. We can't afford to lose you." The words came out harsher than he intended, driven by fear. "Nothing else matters if you're not here, Evelyn. Nothing." Sarah bustled in with cool water and clean cloths, shooing Matthew back. "Let me work. You men are useless in a sick room." But her tone was kind, and she gave Matthew's arm a reassuring squeeze. "She'll be fine. Just needs rest and fluids. Heat and exhaustion, that's all." Matthew paced the small cabin while Sarah tended to Evelyn, feeling utterly helpless. This was his fault. He should have made her rest, should have seen the signs, should have protected her from her own determination. "Stop wearing a hole in my floor," Sarah said finally. "She's resting comfortably. Fever's already coming down. She'll be weak for a day or two, but she'll recover fully." "Thank you," Matthew said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done." "You would have panicked uselessly like most men do." Sarah's expression softened. "But you love her, that's clear. Just remember that love means taking care of each other, which sometimes means making the other person rest even when they resist." After Sarah left, Matthew sat beside the bed watching Evelyn sleep. She looked so young and vulnerable, lying there, all her fierce determination temporarily subdued. He took her hand carefully, feeling the warmth that had scared him earlier now fading to something more normal. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not sure if she could hear him. "I should have been more careful with you. Should have made you stop." Her fingers tightened weakly around his. "Not your fault," she murmured without opening her eyes. "My choice, my body, my limits to learn." "Our choice from now on," Matthew corrected gently. "Partners remember. That means we look out for each other especially when we're too stubborn to look out for ourselves." "Agreed." Her eyes fluttered open, still glassy but focusing on him. "The apples are being handled by Tom and Sarah and everyone else. They told me to stay here with you, that they had everything under control." He stroked her hair gently. "Turns out we're not alone in this fight anymore, Evelyn. We have help whether we thought to ask for it or not." "Community," she breathed. "I'd forgotten what that felt like." "Me too." She drifted back to sleep, and Matthew stayed beside her through the night, checking her temperature, making sure she drank water when she woke, and generally behaving exactly like the useless, panicked husband Sarah had predicted. But he couldn't help it. The thought of losing Evelyn, of this partnership, this love, this future they were building together being ripped away, terrified him more than bankruptcy ever had. By morning, her fever had broken completely, and the color was returning to her face. She woke to find Matthew still sitting beside the bed, looking exhausted. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "Some." "Matthew Kemp, you're terrible at taking care of yourself." "Look who's talking." But he smiled, relief flooding through him at seeing her acting like herself again. "How do you feel?" "Weak, embarrassed, frustrated that my body gave out at such an inconvenient time." She struggled to sit up, and he helped her, propping pillows behind her back. "But I'm alive and recovering, so it could be worse." "It could be a lot worse," Matthew agreed quietly. "You scared me, Evelyn. I scared myself." She took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "But I learned something important. I've been so focused on proving I could handle this life, on being strong enough and capable enough, that I forgot it's okay to have limits. That asking for help or admitting exhaustion isn't weakness. It's wisdom," Matthew said. "Something we both need more of." Over the next 2 days, Evelyn rested while the community continued working the harvest. Matthew split his time between helping with the drying operation and taking care of his wife, bringing her food and water, reading to her from the one book they owned, keeping her company while she regained her strength. By the 5th day, the first batch of apples was fully dried, perfectly dehydrated, sweet tart, and absolutely delicious. Tom brought a sample to Evelyn, who was finally allowed to sit up and take a more active role again. "Try this," Tom said, offering her a piece. Evelyn bit into it, chewed thoughtfully, and then broke into a brilliant smile. "It's perfect. The texture, the moisture, level, the flavor, exactly what premium dried fruit should be." "Then we did it," Matthew asked, hope rising. "We did it!" Evelyn's eyes were bright with triumph. "Now we just need to package it and get it to market." The packaging process took another 3 days, with everyone pitching in to portion the dried apples into cloth bags that Evelyn had sewn with careful precision. Each bag held 1 pound and was stamped with their new business name, Hart Kemp Provisions, using a wooden block that Tom had carved for them. "Very professional," Elizabeth commented, examining a finished package. "You could sell these in any city shop." "That's the goal," Evelyn said. "Quality and presentation matter. We're not selling desperation. We're selling excellence." When the final count was done, they had 73 pounds of premium dried apples packaged and ready for market. Tom had already arranged for them to meet Bill Westmore, the wagon master, who was due in town the following week. Henderson's General Store had agreed to take 20 pounds on consignment. The hotel wanted 10 pounds. A merchant heading to the mining camps had tentatively committed to 25 pounds if the price was right. "That's 55 pounds already spoken for," Matthew said, looking at Evelyn's careful records. "At the prices you've quoted, enough for 3 mortgage payments plus supplies for winter, plus seed money for spring planting," Evelyn finished. She looked up at him, her face reflecting the same cautious joy he felt. "We did it, Matthew. We actually did it." The day they took their first delivery to Henderson's store felt like a coronation. Tom made a show of examining the product, though they all knew he'd already approved it days ago. He opened a package, tasted the fruit carefully, and then nodded with satisfaction. "This is premium quality," he announced. "Better than anything I've carried before. I'll take 30 pounds instead of 20 if you've got it." "We've got it," Matthew said, barely believing this was happening. "And I'll pay up front instead of consignment," Tom continued, "because I know it'll sell fast and I want to establish a good relationship with my suppliers." He counted out bills with careful precision. "That's the agreed-upon price per pound plus a 10% premium for quality." "Fair." Matthew looked at the money more cash than he'd held in years, and his throat went tight. "More than fair, Tom. Thank you." "Thank me by keeping the quality this high and giving me first option on future production," Tom said with a grin. "I've got a good feeling about Hart Kemp Provisions. I think you folks are going to be very successful." Walking out of that store with money in his pocket and orders for more product felt surreal. Matthew kept waiting for something to go wrong for this dream to shatter, like all his previous hopes. But Evelyn was beside him, solid and real, her hand in his, and the money was real, and the future suddenly seemed possible in ways it hadn't for years. "We should go to the bank," Evelyn said quietly. "Make a mortgage payment. Show Thornton we're delivering on our promises. Now, we just got this money, which is exactly why we should go now while we have it, before anything can happen to it." Her voice was firm. "We promised results. Let's show him results." Ernest Thornton looked genuinely surprised when they walked into his office and Matthew laid cash on his desk. "What's this?" "Mortgage payment," Matthew said, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. "Principal and interest current through the end of the month." Thornton counted the money slowly, then looked up at them with something that might have been respect. "I confess I didn't expect you to make any payments at all during the grace period, let alone a full payment including principal." "We're not interested in just surviving," Evelyn said calmly. "We're interested in thriving. This is only the beginning, Mr. Thornton. Hart Kemp Provisions is going to be a substantial operation." "I'm starting to believe that," Thornton admitted. He made out a receipt, his movements precise and official. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Kemp. You've surprised me." That doesn't happen often. Walking out of the bank, Matthew felt something shift inside him. A weight he'd been carrying for 3 years suddenly lifting. They weren't out of danger yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time since his father died, the future held more promise than threat. "We should celebrate," he said impulsively. "How?" Evelyn looked at him with amusement. "We just spent most of our money on the mortgage. We've got enough left for dinner at the hotel restaurant. A real meal, not beans and salt pork. What do you say?" She smiled the kind of smile that lit up her whole face and made his heart stutter. "I say yes. Partners should celebrate their victories together." The hotel restaurant was modest by city standards, but felt like luxury to them. They sat at a corner table, ordered steak and potatoes and vegetables that someone else had prepared, and for a while just enjoyed being together without the constant pressure of work and worry. "Thank you," Matthew said as they waited for their food. "For what?" "For answering my advertisement, for taking a chance on a desperate stranger, for bringing your brilliant mind and your stubborn determination to my failing ranch and turning it into something worth saving." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "For loving me when I'd forgotten how to love myself." Evelyn's eyes went bright with tears. "Thank you for giving me a place to belong, for treating me like an equal when society said I should be ornamental, for valuing what I could do instead of being threatened by it." She squeezed his hand. "For seeing me, Matthew. Really seeing me. How could I not?" "You're extraordinary." "We're extraordinary together," she corrected. "That's the difference. Alone we were both drowning. Together we're building something neither of us could have created on our own." Their food arrived and they ate slowly, savoring every bite and each other's company. Around them other diners came and went, but Matthew barely noticed. His whole world had narrowed to this woman across from him, this partnership that had transformed into love, this future they were creating from nothing but determination and hope. "What are you thinking about?" Evelyn asked, catching him staring at her. "How lucky I am. How this morning 6 weeks ago I was terrified you'd take one look at the ranch and run back to Boston. How every day since then you've exceeded every expectation I didn't even know I had." He paused. How I want to spend the rest of my life building this future with you. Then you shall, Eveline said simply, because I want exactly the same thing. They finished dinner and walked back through town as twilight fell, the September air finally cooling into something comfortable. Lamps were being lit in windows, families settling in for the evening. Pinecrest looked different to Matthew now, not hostile or judgmental, but welcoming. A real community full of people who'd shown up to help when help was needed. At the wagon before climbing up, Eveline turned to him. Matthew, I need to tell you something. What is it? I'm not afraid anymore. Her voice was soft but certain. When I first came here, I was running from failure and shame, just hoping to survive. But somewhere along the way, that changed. Now I'm running toward something, toward this life we're building toward you, toward the future. And I'm not afraid of it anymore. Matthew pulled her close, kissing her with all the emotion swelling in his chest. Good, he whispered against her lips. Because I'm not afraid either. Not anymore. Not with you beside me. They drove home through the gathering darkness, the ranch appearing on the horizon like a promise kept. The barn, the cabin, the orchard, all of it looked different now, transformed by their labor and their love into something worth fighting for. Tomorrow they'd meet with Bill Westmore about bulk orders. Next week they'd start baling prairie grass. In a month, they'd discuss harvesting cottonwood lumber. The work never ended on a ranch, and the challenges would keep coming. But for tonight they had this moment, this victory, this love, this hard-won hope that the future might actually be as bright as they dared to dream. The meeting with Bill Westmore changed everything. The wagon master arrived in Pinecrest on a crisp October morning, his weathered face and sharp eyes marking him as a man who'd spent decades navigating the frontier. Tom Henderson had arranged the introduction, and Matthew and Eveline met him at the general store with samples of their dried apples and carefully prepared price sheets. Hart Kemp Provisions, Westmore read aloud, examining one of their stamped bags. Don't recall hearing that name before. We're new, Eveline said with calm confidence, but our product speaks for itself. Please try a sample. Westmore ate a piece of dried apple, slowly chewing thoughtfully, while they waited in tense silence. Matthew felt Eveline's hand brush against his, a silent gesture of solidarity. Everything they'd worked for came down to moments like this, convincing strangers that their product was worth buying, that Hart Kemp Provisions was worth trusting. This is exceptional quality, Westmore said finally. Better than most of what I see. He ate another piece. You grow these yourselves. We have an orchard on our ranch, Matthew confirmed. Everything is harvested at peak ripeness and dried using traditional methods. No shortcuts, no additives, just quality fruit properly processed. How much can you supply? I provision 3 wagon trains each season, and they all want dried fruit. Problem is finding reliable suppliers who can deliver consistent quality in reasonable quantities. Eveline pulled out her ledger, all business. We have 43 pounds available for immediate purchase. For next season, if we expand our drying operation, we could potentially supply up to 200 pounds with advance orders allowing us to scale up further. Westmore's eyebrows rose. 200 pounds is substantial. You're certain you can deliver that? We're certain, Eveline said without hesitation. We're also developing other products: baled prairie grass, cottonwood lumber, preserved vegetables. Hart Kemp Provisions is committed to becoming a comprehensive supplier for frontier needs. Ambitious. Westmore studied them both carefully. I'll take your entire current inventory, 43 pounds at your quoted price, and I want first option on 200 pounds for next season with a 10% deposit now to secure the commitment. Matthew's heart hammered against his ribs. This was more than they'd hoped for, not just a sale, but a relationship, a commitment, proof that their business model actually worked. Deal, he said, extending his hand. They shook on it, and Westmore counted out payment plus the deposit for future product. The money was real, tangible, transformative. When they walked out of Henderson's store an hour later, they had enough cash to make 3 more mortgage payments and invest in expanding their operation. We did it, Matthew breathed once they were alone in the wagon. Eveline, we actually did it. She was staring at the money in her hands like she couldn't quite believe it was real. We need to be smart about this. Pay down more principal on the mortgage, invest in equipment for next season, maybe hire seasonal help for harvest. We can't spend it all celebrating. I know. He took her face in his hands, kissing her soundly. But we can spend some of it celebrating. We earned this, Evelyn. Both of us. Let yourself feel good about it. Her smile was radiant. I feel better than good. I feel triumphant. We took your father's dying dream and my desperate flight from failure and built something real, something sustainable, something that's actually working. Something that's going to keep working, Matthew added, because we're not stopping here. They didn't stop. Over the next 6 weeks, they threw themselves into expanding the operation with the same fierce determination that had gotten them this far. Matthew built additional drying racks while Evelyn negotiated with merchants up and down the region, establishing relationships and securing advance orders for next season's harvest. They hired Jake Henderson part-time to help with the heavy work, and Sarah referred them to 2 other young men looking for employment. The prairie grass baling operation started in mid-October. Matthew had been skeptical about whether there was really a market for dried prairie grass, but Evelyn's research proved accurate. The cavalry post 40 miles south needed feed for their horses, and the freighting companies wanted it for their livestock. Hart Kemp Provisions filled its first order for 3 tons of baled grass in November, generating revenue that exceeded even Evelyn's optimistic projections. You were right, Matthew admitted one evening as they reviewed the books together. About diversification, about not depending on just one income stream. Every time one product has a slow period, another picks up. It creates stability. It creates survival, Evelyn corrected gently. And eventually, if we're smart and lucky, it creates prosperity. The cottonwood lumber operation launched in December with Matthew and his hired help carefully harvesting trees from the creek bed area. The railroad spur going into the south needed lumber, and Hart Kemp Provisions became one of their regular suppliers. It was hard, dangerous work felling trees, hauling logs, processing them into usable timber, but it generated steady income through the winter months when other operations slowed. They fell into a rhythm as partners that extended beyond business into every aspect of their lives. Matthew handled the physical labor and the logistics of production, while Evelyn managed the finances, the relationships with buyers, and the strategic planning. But those roles blurred constantly. Evelyn proved capable of wielding an axe when necessary, and Matthew discovered he had a knack for negotiation when he approached it with the same straightforward honesty she'd taught him. Their relationship deepened too in ways both small and profound. The careful distance they'd maintained in the early weeks disappeared entirely. They became truly married in every sense, sharing a bed without awkwardness, supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating victories together, building a life that was genuinely theirs. One night in late December, as snow fell softly outside and a fire crackled in the stove, Evelyn showed Matthew a letter she'd been drafting. "What's this, Mike?" he asked, settling beside her on the narrow bed they'd learned to share comfortably. "A letter to my mother's sister in Philadelphia, my aunt. I haven't written to her since the scandal, but—" She paused, uncertain. "I thought maybe now, when we have good news to share, when I can prove that I've built something real here, I thought maybe it was time to reach out." Matthew read the letter carefully. It told the story of their marriage, the ranch, the business they'd built. It spoke of hard work and hope and finding purpose in unexpected places. It was honest about the struggles, but clear about their success. "You should send it," he said. "Your family should know how remarkable you are." What if she doesn't respond? What if the scandal is still too fresh, too shameful? Then that's her loss, not yours. Matthew pulled her close. "But I think she'll respond. I think she'll be proud. How could she not be?" Evelyn sent the letter, and while they waited for a response that might never come, they kept working. The winter was hard, bitter cold, and heavy snow that made everything more difficult, but the business sustained them. Orders kept coming, revenue kept flowing, the mortgage payments were made on time every time, and the balance owed slowly decreased. In January, Ernest Thornton requested a meeting. Matthew and Evelyn went to the bank with some trepidation, unsure what he wanted. But when they sat down in his office, Thornton's expression was almost friendly. "I've been reviewing your account," he said without preamble. "In the 6 months since we restructured your loan, you've made 7 payments, including principal, when you were only obligated to make 6 interest-only payments. You've reduced your outstanding balance by nearly 30%. "We're committed to paying off the debt as quickly as possible," Evelyn said. "I can see that. I can also see that Hart Kemp Provisions has become a substantial operation. You're employing local workers conducting business throughout the region, generating real economic activity. Thornton leaned back in his chair. I'm prepared to offer you a new loan structure. Lower interest rate extended timeline, designed for growth rather than survival. Matthew and Evelyn exchanged glances. What's the catch? Matthew asked. No catch. You're good customers who've proven you can deliver on your commitments. I want to keep that relationship and help you expand. Thornton pushed a paper across his desk. These are the proposed terms. Look them over. Think about it. Let me know. They reviewed the offer carefully over the next week, and it was generous, genuinely generous, designed to help rather than exploit. The new terms would reduce their monthly obligations and free up capital for expansion while still ensuring the bank got paid reliably over time. He's investing in us, Evelyn realized. Not just lending money, but actually investing in Hart Kemp Provisions as an enterprise he believes will succeed. Should we take it? Matthew asked. Absolutely. This is exactly the kind of relationship we need, a bank that sees us as partners rather than risks. She smiled. Your father's dream is becoming bigger than even he imagined, Matthew. We're not just saving the ranch anymore. We're building something that could last generations. They signed the new loan documents in February, and with the improved terms, they immediately began planning for spring expansion, more drying racks for a larger apple harvest, a small greenhouse for early vegetables, additional equipment for the lumber operation. They hired 2 more part-time workers and began training them in the Hart Kemp Provisions methods. The letter from Philadelphia arrived in March, just as the prairie was beginning to show the first hints of green. Evelyn's hands shook as she opened it, and Matthew stood close, ready to support her if the contents were painful. But as she read, her face transformed, shock giving way to joy, giving way to tears. She wants to visit, Evelyn whispered. My aunt. She says she's proud of me, that she always believed in my father's innocence, that she regretted losing touch. She wants to come see what we've built here, and she's bringing her daughter, my cousin, Rebecca, who's apparently in need of a fresh start herself. That's wonderful, Matthew said, holding her as she cried. See, I told you she'd be proud. There's more. Evelyn's voice was choked with emotion. She says there's been new evidence in my father's case. The junior partner who framed him was caught embezzling from another company, and during the investigation he confessed to everything. My father's name is being officially cleared. The newspapers are running retractions. Our family's reputation is being restored. Matthew felt his own throat tighten. Your father would be so happy, Evelyn. Not just about his name being cleared, but about everything you've accomplished. How you took what he taught you and built something real. He'd love you, she said through tears. For treating his daughter as an equal, for valuing her mind, for building this partnership with her. She looked up at him, her face wet but radiant. I wish he could have met you. I wish I could have met him too, but I think he knows somehow. I think both our fathers know what we've built here in their names. The spring planting season brought new challenges and new opportunities. They expanded the orchard with 20 additional apple trees, invested in a small flock of chickens for eggs, and planted their first serious vegetable garden designed for preservation and sale. Every decision was made carefully, guided by Evelyn's meticulous planning and Matthew's practical knowledge of what the land could support. Evelyn's aunt and cousin arrived in April, and their visit was everything she'd hoped for. Aunt Margaret was a warm, intelligent woman in her 50s who reminded Matthew of what Evelyn might become: graceful, but not fragile, refined, but not pretentious. Rebecca was 19 and recovering from a broken engagement, looking for purpose the same way Evelyn had been. This is remarkable, Margaret said, touring the ranch and the business operation. Evelyn, you've built something extraordinary here. Your father would be beside himself with pride. We built it, Evelyn corrected, taking Matthew's hand. Neither of us could have done this alone. That's the whole point. We're better together. Rebecca was fascinated by everything: the business operation, the frontier life, the possibilities of starting fresh in a place where the past didn't define you. Would you consider letting me stay for a while? She asked hesitantly. Maybe work for Hart Kemp Provisions. I need to learn how to stand on my own, and I can't think of better teachers. Matthew looked at Evelyn, who was practically glowing with happiness. We'd be glad to have you, he said. We could use the help, and Evelyn could use the family close by. So Rebecca stayed moving into a small room they added onto the cabin. She threw herself into learning the business with the same determination her cousin had shown, and her presence brought new energy to the operation. Margaret visited often, investing money in Hartkemp Provisions and using her Philadelphia connections to open new markets for their products. By summer, Hartkemp Provisions employed 8 people regularly and supplied merchants across 3 territories. The apple orchard was thriving. The vegetable operation was exceeding projections, and they'd added honey production when they discovered wild bee colonies near the creek. The ranch that had been dying 12 months ago was now a thriving enterprise that anchored the local economy. We need to talk about something, Evelyn said one evening in July as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold and crimson. Matthew's stomach clenched. That tone usually meant serious business. What is it? We've been so focused on building the business on survival and growth that we haven't talked about other things, personal things. She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Matthew, I want a family, children, not right away necessarily, but eventually. I want our children to inherit what we've built here, to grow up understanding the value of hard work and partnership and refusing to give up on your dreams. Relief flooded through him. I want that too. God, Evelyn, I want that so much. I just didn't know if we're ready, she said simply. Not financially, we'll never be completely secure, that's the nature of frontier life, but emotionally as partners, as people who've proven we can face challenges together. We're ready. Then let's do it. Let's build that family the same way we built this business, with determination and hope and absolute commitment to each other. She kissed him, then sweet and promising, and Matthew felt the future unfold before them like the endless prairie, full of possibility, full of challenge, full of hope. The 6-month review with Thornton came and went without drama. The banker looked over their records, noted their continued success, and extended their credit line without being asked. You're my best customers, he said simply. Whatever you need to keep growing, let me know. Tom Henderson started carrying Hartkemp Provisions products exclusively in his store, refusing to stock competitors because nobody else comes close to your quality. Bill Westmore increased his annual order to 500 pounds of dried fruit and started recommending them to other wagon masters. The ranch that Matthew's father had built with such hope that had nearly died with him was reborn as something bigger and better than anyone had imagined. But more than that, it became a symbol of what was possible when people refused to give up, when they supported each other, when they built partnerships based on respect and equality rather than tradition and assumption. In September, exactly 1 year after their desperate apple harvest, Matthew and Evelyn stood in the orchard as workers. Their employees now picked fruit from trees that were healthier and more productive than they'd been in a decade. The drying operation hummed with efficient activity. Orders were backed up for months. The mortgage was nearly paid off. A year ago, I was terrified, Evelyn said, watching the organized chaos of a successful harvest. I thought I was gambling everything on a desperate hope that probably wouldn't work. How do you feel now? Matthew asked, his arm around her waist. Grateful, proud, excited for what comes next. She turned to face him, and the love in her eyes still had the power to stop his breath. But mostly grateful. That you took a chance on me, that you let me be myself, that you built this with me rather than for me. I'm the one who should be grateful. You saved everything, Evelyn. The ranch, the dream me. I was drowning, and you threw me a lifeline I didn't even know I needed. We saved each other, she corrected firmly. That's what partners do. In October, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. They shared the news with Rebecca first, who burst into tears of joy and immediately started planning how to reorganize the business to accommodate Evelyn's reduced work capacity in the later months. Tom and Sarah Henderson threw them a celebration dinner at their home, with half the town showing up to congratulate them. You're building a dynasty, Tom said, raising his glass. Hartkemp Provisions, the ranch, and now a family to inherit it all. That's what frontier success looks like. Ernest Thornton sent a gift, a savings account opened in the baby's name with a substantial initial deposit. For education, his note said, every child should have opportunities. The winter was harsh, but they weathered it easily with their diversified income streams and the support of their employees and community. Matthew spent long evenings by the fire with Evelyn reading to her and talking about the future planning for a child who would grow up never knowing the desperation that had brought them together. "What should we name the baby?" Evelyn asked one night, her hand resting on her growing belly. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him Charles," Matthew said. "After your father." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "And if it's a girl?" "Sarah. After my mother, if that's all right with you. I want our children to carry the names of the people who made us who we are, even if they never got to meet them." "Charles or Sarah Kemp." Evelyn tested the names. "I love it. I love you. I love this life we've built together." The baby, a boy, as it turned out, was born in April, right as the prairie was exploding into spring green and wildflowers. Charles Matthew Kemp came into the world healthy and loud, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn determination already evident in the way he gripped Matthew's finger. "He's perfect," Matthew breathed, holding his son for the first time with shaking hands. "Evelyn, he's absolutely perfect. Like his father," she said, exhausted but radiant, stubborn and brave and ready to fight for what matters. Rebecca, who'd stayed through the pregnancy to help, proved to be a natural with the baby. Aunt Margaret visited for a month, bringing gifts and advice and the kind of familial love that Evelyn had been missing for years. The community rallied around them again, with Sarah Henderson organizing meal deliveries and Mary Sullivan providing child-rearing wisdom earned through raising 5 of her own. Hart Kemp Provisions continued to thrive, even as Matthew and Evelyn adjusted to parenthood. They'd built systems and trained employees well enough that the business could run smoothly, even when they needed to focus on their son. Rebecca took on more responsibility, showing the same head for business her cousin possessed. On Charles's first birthday, they threw a celebration at the ranch. The entire town showed up along with business partners from across the region, employees and their families, and Evelyn's aunt and cousin. The gathering filled the ranch house they'd expanded over the winter, spilling out onto the land that had been saved through determination and partnership. Ernest Thornton attended, which surprised everyone. He gave a short speech praising Hart Kemp Provisions as a model of frontier entrepreneurship and presenting them with the paid-off deed to the ranch, the mortgage satisfied 2 years early. "You've more than proven yourselves," Thornton said, handing the document to Matthew and Evelyn together. "This land is yours free and clear. What you build on it from here is entirely up to you." Matthew looked at the deed, the legal proof that his father's dream was truly secure now that everything they'd fought for was real, and had to blink back tears. Beside him, Evelyn was crying openly, her hand clasped in his. "Thank you," Matthew managed to say. "Not just for the loan restructuring, but for believing in us when we had no reason to believe in ourselves." "You gave me reason to believe," Thornton replied. "You proved that success isn't about starting with advantages. It's about refusing to quit, about adapting when necessary, about building genuine partnerships. You've inspired others in this community to take similar risks, to innovate rather than simply surviving. That matters more than one successful business." As the celebration continued around them, Matthew and Evelyn slipped away for a moment, walking to the orchard with their son in Matthew's arms. The trees were in full bloom, promising another abundant harvest, and the spring air was sweet with possibility. "Can you believe it?" Evelyn asked softly. 2 years ago, I stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but desperation and hope. Now look at us. Now look at us," Matthew repeated, pulling her close with his free arm. "A paid-off ranch, a thriving business, a son, a future we built together from absolutely nothing." "Not nothing," Evelyn corrected. "We had each other. That was never nothing." Little Charles gurgled contentedly, oblivious to the magnitude of what his parents had accomplished, the legacy they were building for him. Matthew looked at his wife and son, at the orchard his father had planted, and they had saved, at the land that represented not just survival, but triumph. "Your father would be so proud," Evelyn said, following his gaze. "Both our fathers would be proud," Matthew replied. "We honored their memories by refusing to let their dreams die, by taking what they taught us and building something even better." They stood there in the blooming orchard, 3 people representing past, present, and future, all the loss and struggle and desperate hope that had brought them together, all the success they'd built through partnership and determination, All the possibility that lay ahead for a child who would grow up knowing his parents had turned failure into triumph through nothing but refusal to give up. Hart Kemp Provisions continued to grow over the years, becoming one of the most successful enterprises in the territory. Rebecca eventually married one of their employees and started her own branch operation. The ranch expanded to include cattle breeding, wheat production, and a small dairy. Matthew and Evelyn had 3 more children, each one learning the business from the ground up. Understanding that success came from hard work and partnership and absolute commitment to quality. But that first son, Charles, was always special. He grew up hearing the story of how his parents met, how his mother had arrived from Boston with nothing but intelligence and determination, how his father had been weeks from losing everything. He learned how they'd saved the ranch through the apple harvest, how they'd built a business on diversification and integrity, how they'd turned desperate hope into lasting success. The secret, his mother would tell him years later when he was old enough to understand, wasn't that we were lucky or brilliant or particularly talented. The secret was that we refused to give up. We supported each other completely, and we treated each other as true equals. Your father valued my mind and my skills. I valued his strength and his knowledge. Together, we were better than either of us could have been alone. That's what real partnership means, his father would add, in marriage and business and life. Finding someone whose strengths complement yours, who challenges you to be better, who stands beside you in the fight rather than behind you or in front of you. Your mother saved me in every way a person can be saved. We saved each other. His mother would correct, taking his father's hand with the easy intimacy of people who'd spent years building a life together. That's the point, Charles. We saved each other. And that became the legacy of Hart Kemp Provisions, not just a successful business or a thriving ranch, but a testament to what 2 people could accomplish when they refused to quit, when they trusted each other completely, when they built something together based on respect and partnership and love that grew from the most desperate of beginnings into something beautiful and lasting. The mail-order bride from Boston and the failing rancher from Nebraska had gambled everything on each other, and they'd won. But more than that, they'd built something worth winning, a life, a family, a future that honored the past while embracing possibility. And on warm summer evenings, years after that first desperate harvest, Matthew and Evelyn would sit on their porch watching the sun set over land they owned free and clear, holding hands like they had that very first night, marveling at how far they'd come, and how very lucky they'd been to find each other when they both needed saving most. "Would you do it all again?" Matthew asked once. "Knowing how hard it would be, would you still answer that advertisement?" Evelyn didn't even have to think about it. "Every single time," she said, "you're my partner, Matthew Kemp, my equal, my love. I'd choose you in every timeline, every possibility, every version of this life. We built something remarkable together." "We did," Matthew agreed, kissing her softly. "And we're not done yet." They never were done. There was always another challenge, another opportunity, another chance to prove that partnership and determination could overcome any obstacle. But that was exactly how they wanted it, because the story of the mail-order bride who saved the ranch wasn't really about desperation or last-minute rescues. It was about 2 people who found each other when they both needed saving, who built something extraordinary from nothing but hope and hard work, who proved that the frontier's greatest resource wasn't land or cattle or gold. It was the courage to keep fighting, the wisdom to accept help, and the love that grew from true partnership between equals who refused to give up on each other or the dreams they chose to build together. That was their legacy. That was their triumph. That was the story they would pass down through generations of Kemps who would work the land their great-grandparents had saved, not through luck or miracles, but through the simple, profound act of choosing each other every single day and building a future together, one stubborn, determined step at a time.